Hey everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. Boxing and history on the menu. Here with my dude Aris Pina, CompuBox operator, fellow history dude. What's up, bro? How are you?
Everything, man. I mean, it's hot as hell over here, but other than that, we cool.
Getting muggy. It's getting muggy. It's getting icky.
Oh, it's like 96 today or something. It's pretty nasty out here. No, what's up?
Usually the focus is on the fighters. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're still talking about some fighters today. However, as you could probably tell by the title, we're talking about trainers too. And although we are going to be spending some time talking about the bad ones, the worst ones, et cetera, maybe some poor performances. I mean, I don't know, dude. I mean, I think we're probably going to have some surprising conversations about bad trainers or whatever in, in during this episode, but there's probably also going to be a lot of focus on the good ones and maybe some just crazy shit too, because that's always fun. But I don't know, man. They're an essential part of boxing, and a number of them have had some really memorable moments in the sport, dude.
I mean, there's been some all-time great trainers. There's been some legendary bad trainers, that have been featured under the spotlight. And there's been some in-betweens, you know what I mean? A lot of guys that get fallen under the radar, and because they weren't
Perhaps
like
some misunderstood too, you know?
absolutely, and like I said, a lot of guys that fallen under the radar for whatever reason, you know what I mean? It's just because they didn't really have the personality or the number of champions or yada 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 and stuff like that. But trainers have been an integral part, if not the most important part of boxing, aside from the fighters in history, going all the way back to like when you think of you know, even like the Sullivan era for, I mean, like John O'Sullivan, for instance, when you think about like his conditioning coaches and stuff like that, getting his notoriously drunk ass in shape for like the Kill Rain fights or other times when he had, near death and everything. You know what I mean? So like going through the years and other guys from like old timers that were able to impart their knowledge on the other younger generations who then became old timers and then imparted their knowledge and others like the knowledge of boxing, everything gone through trainers and how they're able to teach their shit through the years is just incredible. And the evolution of it too, going forward is.
Yeah, I mean, going obviously, if we wanted to start peeling layers back, we could go back to, fucking ancient Greece and shit like that. But even going back to the 1700s, Jack Broughton and
That's right.
developing Broughton's rules and then kind of passing those rules down and not only passing them down, but training other fighters, kind of within those rule sets and also with like, different weapons and shit like that. It's actually super interesting for people. It's dry reading, not going to lie to you, really dry reading, but the concepts are very interesting nonetheless. But point is that yeah, it's ancient, dude. Goes back hundreds of years at least as far as the passing of knowledge and stuff like that from trainers. And as they say sometimes, when you can't do, you teach. And there have been a lot of trainers. Some trainers have been fighters, but a number of trainers weren't fighters or weren't very good fighters.
That's right. And so to touch back on that what you said back to like the 1700s, Broughton's rules and stuff, like trainers from that back in that time period, every time there was like a champion, like the champion of England, because back then that was considered like the universal world champion. And whenever one of those guys would eventually retire, um, they would inevitably either open up a pub or a school, sometimes both. You know what I mean? And but you can think back on a guy like what's his name, the one that beat Mendoza for the belt, Jackson.
Yeah, John
Um,
Jackson.
John Jackson, yeah, gentleman John Jackson, they called him, right? Like he opened a school, and then others would, so on and so forth. I think Tom Cribb might have done the same thing. The first notable black fighter, Bill Richmond. I know he opened a school, subsequently trained Tom Molyneux, so on and so forth. But like you said, things were always imparted on and stuff like that. And then at the turn of the century, that's when you started seeing, especially with some of these old trainers imparting their knowledge on some of these younger guys, and the evolution really took over from there.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that was spreading, especially mostly from from England, and I mean, it gets pretty interesting actually when you start kind of going out from just boxing because of a lot of the techniques that were allowed with wrestling techniques, and then you start breaking down the different kind of like Cumberland wrestling techniques and stuff like that, which then developed to like more freestyle wrestling techniques, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually really interesting from like a mixed martial arts and wrestling history perspective too. But a lot of this stuff was spreading mostly within like the Great Britain kind of islands and shit like that.
Mhm.
And also because the US was like developing, they didn't know what the fuck was what over here at this point, and it wasn't until the 1800s that it really started getting organized. And you could really start looking toward like an international champion or a world champion or something like that. But the knowledge itself, the trainers and the ex fighters and stuff like that, those are the ones who were passing that stuff down, and those are the people that we need to be looking toward, obviously, who pushed forward the evolution of the sport.
1000%. And there's been thousands and thousands upon trainers over the years, like you said. There's been a select few that have been inducted to the Hall of Fame, rightfully so. Sometimes, in my opinion, some of these trainers get over what's the word I'm thinking of over here? Like they get their flowers a little too much, maybe because of like the high end clients that they do like really well with one guy, and then if you look at the rest of their track record, it's kind of whatever. But you know,
No,
um,
that's true.
there's been a few trainers like that, but I mean, for the most part, you got to look at those guys that just consistently been churning out talent. Not only that, doesn't even have to be world champions all the time. Just really, really good fighters. One of those guys that if you have him in his corner, you're going to be in good hands regardless of it. How they're going to look out for you, look out for everything that's going on in there, and just general know-how. So
Yeah, and there's been a number of really unsung trainers too. And obviously, there's absolutely no way we could go through every single trainer in the book
Christ,
on this
that'd be
episode.
like a 15 documentary. I
Yeah,
don't know.
we're gonna do the best we can, and a lot of it's gonna be also it's just like fun, like we're remembering fun stuff and memorable stuff, and not necessarily all of them or ranking them or anything like that. But that said, what's a trainer that you want to talk about, good, bad, otherwise, that is just that guy?
Um, we've discussed him on the show a bunch of times, so we don't really have to stay on the subject of him too long. But I just love his beginning story because, again, this is like old timers imparting knowledge on a younger generation. And then from there, particularly this guy being around for so goddamn long that he was able to impart his knowledge from over six generations, I mean, over 6 decades. You know what I mean? Like it was just incredible. We're talking about Ray Arcel. So the longevity of Arcel, I know there's been a lot of trainers out there that you can compare the longevity of him as well, like guys like Angelo Dundee. I guess not Joe Bernstein when you really think about it, right? How old is he now?
Gosh, old. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how old, but I know he's
he's
elderly.
up there. Yeah, yeah, and a few others, but Arcel's story is just incredible in the fact that he was born in 1899 in Indiana, moved to New York City at a young age, and right away was in a tough neighborhood where as a young Jewish kid, and I think what was he in like an Italian neighborhood or something. He had to
I
learn
think
how to
so. Yeah.
Yeah, he had like most kids around that time, he had to learn how to fight pretty quickly because you go outside, there's gonna be a bunch of dudes trying to pick on you and take whatever you have, whether it be your newspapers or this or that, and just gonna try to beat your ass. So Arcel quickly learned that he had to defend himself, became a pretty good fighter himself on the street, and found himself, like most did back then, into a boxing gym. But then this is the story of how it gets really interesting because he finds two guys that, as opposed to wanting to become a fighter, he gets more interested in the aspect of how to develop a fighter because that's where his mind was going with that. Like, he found it fascinating how you could take a guy and get him into condition, the best possible condition to be able to fight somebody else. And he was also fascinated about coming up with like a game plan to beat somebody. And then so we found these two old timers at that time. Now think about this. This is already like the turn of the century. This is like the early 1900s. So like 1911, 12, 13, around that time when Arcel was starting to like wander around the gyms and get interesting. And he finds these two guys. One of them was Doc Bagley, and the other one was a trainer from a Welsh trainer named Di Dawlings. And this is what we were talking about at the kind of a little bit earlier, where you find old timers, and now for the first time, at least in my thoughts, that these guys are taking techniques and other things like that and teaching and imparting it on a what would become at that time a very young generation and a person who wanted to learn. And at that point, how many people really wanted to be trainers? Everyone was looking to be fighters and trying to make money that way. Arcel was like a diamond in the rough, and they're like, all right, kid, well, if you want to listen, I'll tell you.
Especially because I mean, all of the history goes together, as we've said numerous times on a lot of these history based episodes and stuff like that, that the wider history of boxing and then world history, it's all connected. And
Yeah.
so the way that boxing was developing, especially in the US then, it hadn't really gotten hot. You know, that wasn't really until like the late 1900s, 1920s where it really took off. And a big part of that was the amount of immigrants who were coming to the US, and the idea that boxing didn't really require much and that you could just be a fighter and people needed money. Sometimes people had to fight for money, you know. And again, also there were other figures and sports figures that made it popular too in the 1920s. But at that time, it wasn't really popular yet. It hadn't really caught on like that. So yeah, there couldn't have been too many people going into gyms or young kids, teens, 20s, whatever, going in and saying, I want to be a boxing trainer. It
Yeah.
probably hadn't been, you know, popular yet by that point. And so it would have been a far more like coveted type of some of the knowledge that you were receiving. You know, they talk about now, and it's kind of like an old crusty fucker type of thing to say, where like, you know, they don't teach that shit anymore. Like the knowledge is dying. In a lot of ways, it kind of is, and it has, especially when you think about what was being passed on more than 100 years ago.
1,000%. And Arcel, with both guys, he learned with Dowlings about like conditioning. And Dowlings, he said, I think was like a long distance runner or another. So was Arcel in high school. He was a track and field star. So Arcel knew how to get in shape, and one of the things
Fights
like
still going 25 rounds and shit.
absolutely just I mean that was a normal occurrence back then. If these guys
God.
back at Arcel, because he lasted forever, saw the evolution of the whole sport passing by. But if we're talking about those two old timers, like Arcel's mentors, if they were around and had a chance to see how, I'm sure they were already kind of shell shocked when fights just got scheduled for 15 rounds, and that was that at that point. But like, if they were around for like the whole, separation of different title belts and all this other shit, like,
They're like, oh, you only get fucking 45 minutes to work? What the fuck?
yeah, yeah, what is this? My guy's not even warmed up at that point. So,
I'm just getting
um,
into it.
with Doc Bagley, he learned the arts of like how to stop cuts. Bagley was a master cutman, and he was most famous for being Gene Tunney's manager, right?
I
And
think he
so
worked his corner or something. Yeah.
yeah, so he was Tunney's cutman and manager, kind of trainer, whatever. And in Tunney's first fight with Harry Greb, that's most famous for no one, I don't know, like we both discussed about it before. It's probably grown in lore over the years, but is generally recognized that Tunney got the absolute shit kicked out of him. Like his face was just a mass of blood. Everyone can just recognize that. How much blood there actually was, no one really knows. I don't think there's any photos that exist of that fight, at least up close like that, let alone any footage. So, just going by off accounts, it was bad. And then afterwards, Bagley, I guess, told Tunney in the locker room afterwards when he was still bandaging up, he was like, "Kid, you really made me work out there tonight." While he was still, because the whole time through the first round to the last, he was over there and taking shit and just blocking it, blocking it, blocking it. And Arcel said that Bagley, one of the things he used to do, because the guy always was chewing the water, chewing tobacco, and to show you the ruthlessness and I guess the lawlessness back then. Bagley during corners, if one of his fighters was cut, he would take the piece of chewing tobacco and plug it in his fighter's eye and leave it like that. And that would usually stop the flow of blood. Then you would send them back out there for the next round.
An underrated and kind of funny portion of, you know, Cutman history and whatever. And it's something that you can view all the way up until, I want to say, the 80s. I think maybe the late 70s, but I believe it was the 80s. Um, a lot of shit started changing, especially after Mancini Kim. That was a catalyst for a lot of change in boxing. But I mean, point being, going back to Arcel and you know, the people he was learning from, up until the 70s and 80s, a cut man in a corner was allowed to like make their own shit.
Yeah.
And by that I mean like their own concoctions, their own liniments, their own fucking whatevers. And I posted not that long ago a fucking photo of Charlie Goldman, like so in an old issue of, I think it was Life magazine, they did a spread on Charlie Goldman, who was, of course, Rocky, most famously Rocky Marciano's trainer. And he used to carry around a fucking leather bag. And I swear this is relevant. Just hang tight. He used to carry around a leather bag, and, you know, like almost like a little doctor bag. And it said Dr. CG, Dr. Charlie Goldman. He was not a doctor, but they just fucking put Dr. CG on there. And he emptied out the contents of this bag for this photo spread and put it all out on this table. And it's just like a dozen fucking bottles of who fucking knows what, scissors, some scalpels and shit, some fucking like medical bandaging, tape, all this sorts of shit. It, like, basically the type of shit where like it was like a kind of a like a first aid kit, essentially, you know, basically an expanded first aid kit. Point is, going back 100 years or whatever, dude, they were probably using cocaine. They were probably using fucking all sorts of crazy drugs and substances and all of this type of shit to stop cuts, tobacco, whatever they. I've heard fucking stories about sawdust, because they used to fucking put sawdust on the canvas and in the rings, you know, in order, like, if they, especially if there was blood and sweat and shit dripping around. And then back then the canvas would get all fucked up and nasty, because, like, you know, you couldn't really clean it like they can now because it's like vinyl or something. And so, you know, etc., they used to put sawdust. And then I'd heard stories and read stories about them picking up sawdust and putting that in. What the fuck, are you kidding me? No wonder these guys were fucking, like, you know, 50 years old and just done for health wise. They got sawdust in their shit. So point is, yeah, this shit was wild 100 years ago, bro. Wild, wild west.
It really was. And so Arcel said in the book I have near me, what is it right here, in the corner, um, where Dave Anderson around 1990 interviewed a bunch of trainers. I think all of them have since passed. I don't remember everyone in the book, but one of those books again that you can't really like recreate. I guess you could do it with current trainers and let it age like that, but you know, very important book. And anyways, Arcel says in that, in one of the stories, going back to the taking the chewing tobacco and plugging it into the eye to stop cuts. Arcel found that fascinating, and he said that that was his thing, is that when he started working corners, that's all he wanted to do. You know, and the first time he was allowed to work a corner, he said by himself. He grabbed some chewing tobacco, and he was hoping that his fight was going to get cut so he can take it and shove it into his eye and shove him back out there. So he says during the fight, during like the first or second round, he's sitting there ringside, and he's getting so excited about, while what he was watching, is that he swallowed his plug of chewing tobacco by
Ugh.
accident. Yeah.
Blech.
For a guy who wasn't a smoker, by all accounts, kept himself and really clean and healthy all the time, that obviously was not going to work well. Even if you are a smoker, I can't imagine swallowing a plug of chewing tobacco and your stomach just being happy with that. You know what I
Bro,
mean? So,
many years ago, I was a smoker for a long time, and I briefly tried some of those little pouches that you stick inside your lip, and I was like,
yeah,
ugh, like, even then.
dude, it's disgusting to me. Absolutely. I mean, if you ever watch wrestling and you saw Stan Hansen back in the late 80s and early 90s, like I did watching him in WCW, just going there with this chewing tobacco literally dripping down over there, beating the hell out of some poor schlub, and then having the tobacco drip all over the guy's face. Sure, that guy only got paid $50 for that ass kicking, and then
Awful.
Hansen stumbling back over. Yeah, no thanks. So he swallows that, and he said that before the fight even ended, he had to be taken out and going to the hospital because he started throwing up and getting really sick.
I would believe it. I totally would. That's awful and fucking disgusting. Terrible.
Sure, but for twist, so he learns from those two guys that becomes his mentors. He with Di Dawlings. Dawlings was the trainer of Ted Kid Lewis, I believe, the welterweight champion. And so right away there, Arcel is already mixing with really good company. And I think he said Dawlings was the dude who did not take the train ever. And Arcel lived on like the LES or something like that. So he would walk all the way like 128th Street or something ridiculous just to meet with Dawlings, then walk down to the gym and then walk back with him and then walk back home again because he would never like have money for the train. Like he just walk an absurd amount just because he wanted to take the knowledge in and walk with him for that distance and pick his brain, which of course, worked out in the end for him. So he starts working with these guys. He works with Ted Kid Lewis in his corner a couple of times. yeah, as an understudy to Dollins, and then eventually he gets to branch off a little bit, and then he gets his first champion with the bantamweight there, not Charlie Goldman, what's his name? Rosenberg. Charlie Phil Rosenberg.
Mm.
And that's the first time with Arcel where you hear like his crazy regiments of like how he can get a guy in shape. Famously Rosenberg, I think what the story was is that he was fighting for the bantamweight championship, but he was absurdly overweight. And they only had a limited amount of time for him to lose this weight. And Arcel put him on this rigid diet of him not being able to do anything, not eating this, not doing that, not even being able to like drink water and all this shit until Arcel slept right next to him in the same room and just, you know, was just on his ass. Dude starts losing his mind to the point one day, I guess Arcel awakens because he heard Rosenberg like rummaging. And Rosenberg's trying to go to the bathroom, and Arcel's like, "What are you doing?" He was like, "Nothing. I'm just gonna go gargle some water." And Arcel follows him. He was like, "What the hell? You gonna go to the bathroom with me?" He was like, "Yeah, yeah." He was like, "I'm gonna watch your Adam's apple to make sure you're not swallowing anything." And he's just like, you know, and that's the type of taskmaster shit he had to be on. But from there, his career just started rolling. And I mean, and this is the other thing too, is that like back then, once you started getting champions, and then you have other guys as well, everybody was getting work. Boxing, even in the teens into the early 20s was huge, really popular, especially in the New York area. And there was gyms all over the place. So this gave guys like Arcel and others to start working together. And that's why they started forming teams. Like you mentioned, Charlie Rosenberg was over there, and now what was it? Charlie Goldman, excuse me. Charlie Goldman was a trainer at this point because he was a former fighter from that same era. Arcel now had teamed up with another vastly underrated trainer over the years now, Whitey Bimstein, and those two became like a superhero. Became like the mega powers, more or less, of boxing at that time.
Another guy that well, and this was all kind of around the same time, I suppose. Like Sixto Escobar, of course, was trained by Whitey Bimstein,
Mhm.
probably one of the around that time one of the more famous fighters that he trained. But also, just to kind of also illustrate Arcel's personality and the way he dealt with fighters was Lou Nova and Lou Nova's dealings with the Omnipotent, and basically long story short, that's its own podcast. I mean, honestly, you know what? We're doing one. I don't give a fuck when it is. Doesn't have to be next week. It'll be sometime though, because it's an entertaining and fucking pretty hilarious story, to be honest. But long story short, Lou Nova had been kind of duped essentially by this total fucking scam artist, this dude who was promoting yoga and essentially calling himself this, guru, I guess, enlightened fucking guru. I can't even remember his real name. It does not even that important, but he called himself the Omnipotent, and he had convinced Lou Nova that he could draw from fucking cosmic power. Basically, no, this is not a comic book, and yes, I love Silver Surfer, but no, he basically said that he could use this cosmic power in order to develop a quote unquote cosmic punch, and that he could knock people out with this cosmic punch and potentially fucking knock down. I think what he said was knock through walls or something like that. Anyway, it was clearly not the case. Dude got absolutely moited by fucking Joe Lewis, and it was awful. And then he kind of slowly went away or whatever. But point is, Ray Arcel was training Lou Nova this entire time, and even Ray Arcel was going to newspapers and was like, "Yeah, this guy's a nut, dude. I don't really believe anything this guy's saying. But if he's going to convince my fighter that he could kick ass, then I don't really care. I'm just going to be there training him." So, I mean, but the entire time Ray Arcel was like a voice of reason. He was like, "This guy's full of shit, you guys."
And at that point, by the time he was training Lou Nova, Arcel was like a veteran of the game. Like he had been around for a number of years. You know what I mean? He was not no spring chicken at that point, even though he was probably in his 40s or so. No, late 30s. But like it's funny to think about, you know what I mean? Like he becomes at that point, like besides having, world champions with Whitey Bimstein and doing things like that, he becomes essentially what they were called the meat wagon for Joe Lewis, because almost half of Lewis's title challengers were trained by Arcel. And so it became like a running gag when you would see Arcel in the corner there drudging out another guy just to get absolutely walloped in a handful of rounds by Lewis.
And like you said earlier too, sometimes it wasn't like Ray Arcel was this fighter's trainer or whatever. He was like a hired gun, like a lot of trainers wind up being at some point where they're not necessarily developing fighters from their teens or whatever, but they're hired
Mhm.
as high profile trainers, as he was even at a fairly young age. But he was hired as, to try to get these guys to beat up Joe Louis, and it never worked. And one of the anecdotes that he told later on was that at some point, like, the fucking seventh, opponent or whatever, he comes up into the ring pre-fight and they're giving instructions. And Lewis looks up and says, "You again?" And Ray Arcel
Yeah.
just started laughing because he was just like, "I don't even know what to say at this point. Just stop beating up my fucking fighters."
And what she did, man, he pummeled all those guys. And so I think the first time he got a win over Lewis was when he was in Ezra Charles's corner, wasn't he? When
I think so, yeah.
yeah, when Lewis was completely washed, making a
Yeah,
comeback.
pretty fucking washed.
Yeah.
And there was
But
and there was a lot of nonsense going on behind the scenes by that point already too.
sure. And that's when boxing started getting really funky too at that point. So Arcel, like we said, was already a veteran. He had been around, and if you already name it's too many champions to name off the top of your head at this point, but he's already been with a bunch of world champions, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And now with boxing and the mob, like he's already been around Jacob's Speech for a number of years. Now he's starting to see the IBC and Jim Norris and stuff trying to come in and taking over. And boxing is like is being televised at this point now and other stuff like that. And Arcel is trying to like cut his men's and promote fights outside of it. He had a deal where he was going to make some I think it was in Boston, in the Boston area, where he had a television deal and he was promoting weekly shows over there. And well, that's not going to sit well with the mob who's not getting a cut of that. And so one day Arcel was just taking a stroll. Someone decided to walk up to him with a paper bag and clock him over the head. Doesn't seem like that would be bad in retrospect, but I mean, when you find out the paper bag had a lead pipe hidden in it, well, it becomes a little bit worse. Arcel falls into a coma and decides he's not going to be involved in boxing anymore for a little bit. Um, we already know the story about his comeback and everything like that, how, he associates with Duran, and that's been written about in many books and magazines, featured in films, yada, yada, yada. But like, I always just I was talking about this with you the other day because the anniversary came up. The thing about late era Arcel that I love, besides the Duran work and others that other things that he did at that point, was that fight that he did with Larry Holmes. You know what I mean? With against Jerry Cooney. And so in 1982, Ray Arcel is what, 81? Yeah, he's 81. No, he's at like 83 at this point, 82, 83. And God, the man has seen it all. You know what I mean? Like the fact that he's still active and he still wants to be in someone's corner. And not only is he in the corner, he's in there with Eddie Futch. And those two became, and in my opinion, having Eddie Futch and Ray Arcel in the corner together makes that the greatest 1-2 combo ever. Like you can't really beat that. And I know it's up to the fighter to be able to win the fight eventually, obviously, and stuff like that. But if you're coming equipped with the big guns, I mean, like you can't get any better than that. And what I love about it, what I was saying is that like Arcel wasn't like phoning it in, like being there as a face, as like sometimes, like you said, you can hire someone and they're just there more for show than them actually doing anything. Like Arcel clearly was still in the same game mode that he was back in the game when he first started in the early 1910s. He still had that same mindset. He was still over there wiping his fighter down, doing the same things he was doing in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. All that shit. It was just unnatural to him. You know what I mean? Well, the intensity in his face, from everything about that. So at one point, he grabs Holmes by the shoulder before one of the round started and grabs him and goes, "Don't let that big bum steal the title from you." And then shoves him back out, like shit like that. You know what I mean? Like, it was really cool to see. Like, I just love that fight for a number of reasons. The build up for it, the fight's very good in itself. Um, but I just love the corner work of those guys. And one other thing too, and we can move on after this, is that like remember that massive low blow that Holmes lands on, that Cooney lands on Holmes, like one of the worst ones in history, at least recorded.
That shit was
And
bad.
when they're in the corner, it's one thing that will never be allowed again. I'm surprised Mills Lane allowed this in the first place, was that Holmes goes over there and they start giving him water and they're like wiping him down and all that stuff, which again, like I know this is a break, but you're not supposed to be able to do that. While Cooney's just in a neutral corner standing there looking dopey. And so, like, same thing though. Arcel took it immediately and started doing his old school tactics, rubbing him down, doing his thing, opened up his trunks, threw some ice down there, sprayed some water in there too, whatever. Like, dude was just new as shit. You know what I mean? He was still with it. Like everything was just, yeah, he moved a little bit slower going up the stairs and everything like that. But like even the way he dressed, he still had the slacks and the button down shirt over, with the silk Larry Holmes robe over it. Like just old school to a T, man.
And remember, you're the king of cauliflower row.
Yeah.
Saying some shit from like 1930 where you're like, what the fuck is that? What do you mean?
Because Barry Tompkins makes the comment too afterwards when Arcel goes, "Don't let that big bum steal the belt from you." And he goes, "Sage advice from 82-year-old Ray Arcel."
Yeah, just like your sage advice on fucking that'll I'll never get old. Fucking Ray Arcel snapping back at
Oh yeah, yeah. When he was like, "Well, Tommy Gibbons was unranked, and I think if that happened today, the boxing world would be like really angry, wouldn't they?" And he was like, "Bro, well, clearly you don't know who Tommy Gibbons is. What the hell are you talking about?"
somebody doesn't know their history right to his face.
Like, Harry grabbed the worst beating of his entire career. Like one of the best fighters of that generation. If you're gonna come back and fight somebody, that's about as legit as it gets. What do you mean?
Yeah. Come on. You are mistaken, sir.
And what kind of ratings were really back in Dempsey's era too? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, it's a little bit different from saying unranked now, where anybody could get fucking ranked. Back then, it was a little more loose as far as the rankings. Come on, come on.
Yeah. So
Well, let's talk about since you brought him up. Definitely worth talking about. You got to go with Eddie Futch. Definitely
absolutely.
also, dude. Legendary career. Also saw. I mean, many eras of boxing himself. He died in what 2001 at 90
Mhm.
years old. So, didn't quite have the spread or the longevity or well, I could say a different type of spread than Ray Arcel. But he himself had a little bit more personal experience in boxing. And there are a number of photos of him too, actually, as a fighter. So you could see a little bit more, but he was a fighter in, I want to say, the Navy in the 1930s, I think. And so he had a lot more personal experience with boxing. That being said, the breadth of his fucking training career is pretty wild when you see not only the number of fighters that he trained, because like I said earlier, once you reach a certain point, you see a lot of trainers who are kind of like, I don't want to speak badly about them, but almost like stuck in like a local gym or a small gym, or they're working with like local kids or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Like their boxing needs those trainers, but on like the kind of elite level or higher level or whatever, especially when trainers become famous or get a name or work with a really big fighter, etc., they become hired guns and they start working with a who's who of fighters. But I mean, starting in the 19 probably I guess in the 1960s was really when he rose to prominence as a team with oh shit, gosh, brain fart, fucking massive brain bubble. Joe Fraser's Yank Durham,
Oh,
sorry.
oh, yeah, yeah. Fuck, now you made me think about it too. His trainer that passed away relatively, Yank Durham.
Yeah, Yank Durham.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yank Durham. Mhm.
So with kind of combined with Yank Durham, Eddie Futch had it sounded like similar to we were talking about Ray Arcel a moment ago, and sometimes people get kind of worked up when you talk about Ray Arcel and the kind of work that he did, and then you don't bring up Freddie Brown, which I get because Freddie Brown, especially when you're talking about specifically Roberto Duran, because it wasn't just people kind of apply that as a blanket thing where like, oh, Ray Arcel didn't do anything, it was all Freddie Brown. With Roberto Duran, that is often the case. Yeah, like even Duran was like, yeah, he came in like a week or two, before fights, and we would kind of go over strategies and shit like that. But it was Freddie Brown who was there like all the time. Freddie Brown was the trainer, but Ray Arcel was the trainer for a lot of other fighters. And however, similarly in this specific instance, Eddie Futch had done some work with Joe Frazier, but Yank Durham was the one who had spent more personal time training Joe Frazier, which kind of makes a lot of sense when you look at the style and stuff like that, and the fact that part of it was his physical limitations and height and stuff like that, but also Joe Frazier's style didn't really evolve or change, or strategies didn't evolve or change really all that much over the course of what, 15 years. So he made that one thing work fantastic for him. But point is, Eddie Futch, that is really where he kind of rose to prominence, working with Joe Frazier in the 1960s. But the thing is, when you were training a guy like Joe Frazier and getting a win in 1971 against somebody like Muhammad Ali, your star is gonna shoot up. Not only Joe Frazier's, but your trainers too. And Eddie Futch really, rose from there as well.
Oh yeah, and by that time again, Futch, like Ray Arcel, we mentioned when we said when he was training guys for Joe Louis in the 30s, Arcel was already a veteran. By the 60s, Futch was already a veteran in boxing. Like he wasn't a prominent name in terms of training guys, like you said, but he had been around for a long time. He was a former fighter himself. He came up in the Detroit area at the Brewster Center. And he used to train alongside Joe Louis quite often. I think they were part of like the same amateur team and stuff like that. And he always used to mention how Louis, especially, you had to be careful sparring Louis because he didn't care what size you were. He was going to take it easy on you. And especially if he had a girlfriend or two hanging around that he wanted to impress, he would try to knock you out. So, like, Futch
Who's gonna
instead,
stop him?
yeah, right. And I think a couple of times Lewis would tell Futch, he was like, Eddie, you're going to go 3 rounds with me today. And then you see a girlfriend on the side, and Eddie was like, I'm not going 3 rounds with you. What do you mean? And Lewis is like, no, no, we're gonna, and he was like, I promise I'll be okay. And he was like, no, I'm not being stupid. I'm not going to go run around you while you try to take my head off. But anyways, he earned his stripes over there. A heart murmur ended his career early on. And from there, he basically, he had to stop fighting. And he would have been a really good fighter if he kept on going with it. Clearly, he had the talent for it, and he was holding his own with everyone around there, and he won a number of amateur titles. But it wasn't the end for him. Soon after that, I know he said he became he worked at a post office and took other odd-end jobs to help, like, support his family and such. But he kept on training guys, staying around the gym, learning, developing, picking up techniques, and eventually started handling fighters himself. And now at this point, too, in the 1940s, Futch is like around incredible dudes, not just talking Joel Lewis, but just like some all-time great fighters. For instance, Holman Williams was around him, and he was learning and sort of watching him in the gym all the time, and a number of other fighters. Holman Williams was one of the first fighters he ends up training, which Futch said he was kind of shocked at because Futch, when Holman Williams asked him to handle him for a fight, and Futch was like, why would you want to ask me? Like, you already know everything. You know more than I ever would. And Williams said something to the effect of, like, that he knew he was smart and trusted him to take care of things. And his career started rolling from there. And he worked with a lot of great fighters from that era. Um, and his first champion, I think, was, correct me if I'm wrong, Don Jordan, the
Yeah,
welterweight, right?
yeah. Mhm.
So go ahead.
Yeah, he handled a lot of Don Jordan's career. And of course, Don Jordan,
Absolute maniac.
yeah, involved in a lot of wild stuff from around that era, and kind of a key figure in a lot of the things that happened around that era too, that kind of broke open a lot of weird, happenings and stuff, which probably its own podcast fucking
That's what I was gonna
series.
say, man. We have to do a Don Jordan episode because
We
that
really could. Yeah, we really could. I mean, that was like a crossover fucking true crime, boxing history, whatever is. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on there. But yeah, that was his first world champion, and he trained a number of fighters from around that time. Eddie Jones was a guy from the 1960s and 70s that he had trained as well. I mean, but like, yeah, there a lot of the oh, damn, dude, there was so much happening right in the 1960s, like in the world and also in the world of boxing. That's just fucking
yeah.
nuts.
And eventually, like you said, so Futch is, in that area, he's training Don Jordan and stuff, and then eventually he gets brought on to work with Frazier's team. Um, and after I forgot what year it was after Foreman. So I want to say what 73, 74 is when Yank Durham passed away around then.
Think so. I know it was in the 70s.
Yeah, because he died
Yep,
suddenly of a stroke.
73.
73. Okay. So he dies suddenly of a stroke. And from there, Eddie Futch basically takes over as Frazier's main trainer. And subsequently takes over a lot of the Philadelphia guys around that area too.
Yep. And also in that same stable too, Ken Norton, of
Yeah,
course, somewhat famously, because that was a fight that never really developed for a handful of reasons, timing partially, but also because they said they didn't want to fight each other and were friends and stuff like that too, which kind of sucks because that probably would have been a pretty fun fight. But nonetheless, Ken Norton famously during that time, yeah.
that's right. And so Futch at this point, I mean, this is already going into the 70s now. I mean, he's been around for a minute. Like he's not a young pup in this game. And he's just putting in this knowledge and like, yeah, he's staying primarily with Frazier. I know at one point he has a falling out with Norton. And he takes on a few other side projects. Like not everything is a complete success for Futch. You know what I mean? Like, he tried to take on Dwayne Bobbick for his management, and that was a complete failure. And there were a couple others and stuff like that. But
Bobby Chacon,
he tried to train Bobby Chacon.
pretty sure.
Oh shit. Didn't even know that pair up. Um, and others, but he was, another guy too that could be brought in at that point as a hired gun. But after Frazier's career, those two more or less had a falling out also after Manila because Futch, famously pulling Frazier out in the last round and stuff like that. And Frazier wanted to protest, and who knows how that last round would have what would happen in that last round because Ali was dead beat too. But everyone that wants to say that Ali would be like, oh no, Frazier would have knocked him out or something. Probably not, because if Ali was forced to fight, he was gonna fight. Like, I think the reason why he's collapsed is because he finally was able to relax and his body just like collapsed from that. But if he was
Yeah,
still in here,
totally.
like, I gotta get up and fight again, like he was gonna do it. You know what I mean?
Well, and it also, and I'm not calling Ollie a liar, but
Yeah.
it makes the story better if you were to say I was gonna quit if he didn't. You know what I'm saying? Like then it makes it a little better in my opinion. So I get it.
And
But
in somebody's book, I don't know which book it was, but they say that another story I heard was that Willie Monroe was in Frazier's corner that night. And he is. You see photos of him and video of him there. And the middleweight contender I'm talking about.
yeah, yeah.
And he, at one point, they said he was in Ali's corner before 14th and 15th, and he overheard Ali say he's going to quit. And he tried running over to the Frazier corner to get their attention, saying, don't stop it, don't stop it. But I don't know if that was any truth to that or not.
I probably would have been telling my corner I was gonna quit from like round two on.
I mean,
So that might not have even meant anything. But
imagine fighting in that place, man. Like, I was talking to someone about it the other day when it was like really hot out, and I was wearing that shirt actually from that fight. And I'm like, being in that arena, everything just encompassed in there. You're not even fighting, you're just in the corner. You know what I mean? Like, I would have to have 18 towels just draped in ice around me at all times, hoping just. I would have lasted maybe 5 rounds before I pulled a Ruby Goldstein or what was it, and he got taken out of the ring in the Robinson fight, like that type of shit. Like, no, 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 no. And those
fuck
two
that.
went hellaciously for 14 rounds, man. Mm-mm.
And so I don't blame Eddie Futch for looking out for his fighter like that, bro. Because well, and I
Totally.
mean, look at the result too. Because Joe had already had eye issues, and then they had just gotten worsened, and then he wound up with he wound up not super great health wise. So I mean, did that really change anything that one round? I don't know, but that's what partially what the trainer's there for, to look out for his fighter, and he did. But like going on too, like we said, Futch had, well, Ken Norton had a falling out with, just about everybody. He was a kind of a surly guy. He didn't really seem like a super, he was kind of a salty dude. But going forward, little fucking bit, going forward, Futch worked with a ton of fighters and a ton of big name fighters too, dude. Like, for instance, he trained Virgil Hill for a while. Virgil
Right.
Hill is unfortunately kind of forgotten during the 1980s and early 90s, where he was pretty dominant, albeit in a not very good light heavyweight division for the most part, but dominant nonetheless and very skilled, and was able to, dominate over a fairly long period of time. Worked with Alexis Arguello,
Yep.
famously. I don't know how many fights. I know for a little bit, but I don't think for like a super long time. But that being said, still an extremely great fighter to work with, but probably the most high profile fighter after that, or at least in terms of like, the prize that he won, Riddick Bowe, of course, because he won the heavyweight championship, and being in Riddick Bowe's corner for winning the heavyweight championship. He still went on to work a little more after that too, but that was a pretty big, especially, that many years after starting his career as a trainer. Fucking big
Oh,
news.
absolutely. And not only that, like it was the way like you can clearly tell he really orchestrated Bo's style to make like to fine tune him over the years because Bo still was a work in progress when he first turned pro. Like the tools were there, you just really need to like put them all together. And Futch was instrumental in doing that and making him, as a big man who was able to work on the inside and utilize everything they had to his advantage. And I mean, like it all came together that first Holyfield fight. That was a Futch project through and through. And like you said too, man, it made for a great outside the ring story too, because Riddick Bowe, who was always like a really nice, affable guy, would be over there lovingly hugging Eddie Futch, who was so much tinier than him, and all grayed out and everything. Oh, my Papa Smurf, and like rubbing
Mhm.
his head and shit. And that was always like the little nickname. And both of them decked out in their Fila jumpsuits and all that, early 90s. But yeah, definitely. And he also did a lot of work with Marlon Starling in the late 80s and was instrumental in Starling being the dominant champion of the welterweights by the time that decade ended. And his last great win too. I think here's the thing too is that for whatever reason, a lot of guys, boxers are always salty people. You know what I mean? And they always seem to think that they know more than the trainer or something can happen or whatever, right? And so like Futch was no different than anyone else that if they suffered a loss, and Futch did have losses. It wasn't like he just had strict wins all the time. Um, they like to blame someone. You know what I mean? Alexis Arguello famously fired Eddie Futch after he lost to Aaron Pryor the first time. And that one's interesting in a sense too, because Arguello is always looked upon at that point as the perfect gentleman and a guy that would always, do not do a gesture like that. And for him to, lash out at Futch and blame
Yeah.
him for the loss was kind of like way out of character for him. And eventually he did apologize, but that was like, and Starling the same thing. Starling, who was always not Mr. Gentleman and kind of an aloof guy who was cocky and thought very highly of himself and thought that he was, smarter than a lot of people. I think fired Futch or tried to as well at one point. And then Futch also, kind of gave him some sage advice. Was like, yeah, you do know a lot, Marlon, but like I've taught you more than what you know, and blah blah blah. And Marlon eventually thought about it and brought him back into camp. But so what I'm getting at is that like his last great win was Montel Griffin against Roy Jones. And when you think about it, like, oh yeah, well Roy got, that was bullshit disqualification. Blah, blah. Nah, bro. Like if you
Hit him
watch that,
twice.
yes. Not only did he hit him twice, like, and that was a legit DQ. Roy was frustrated in that fight. Roy
He
did not look good
acted
in
for
that.
sure, but you can't
Yeah,
hit them while they're down.
absolutely not. And not only that, Roy was frustrated in that fight. Like, Montel Griffin at that point, he was the 92 Olympian, uh, a light heavyweight, and with like the height of Dwight Cowie, and kind of fought at the same weird crouch as him. Not as physical as Cowie and not as strong, but he didn't need to be. He had a little bit of a different style. He was more of a boxer as opposed to like a pressure counterpuncher. And Futch, again, this is like one of those guys who have been around for so long. He just knew he's seen every style there is, even a style as unpredictable as Roy Jones. There's ways to fight every type of guy. There's a style that's going to stymie and give you fits any type of way. And Futch came up with a system like he did for Ali back in the day and like he did for others. Just tweaked it a little bit here and there that he knew was going to frustrate the shit out of Jones. And what was it? Like he just had him jabbing out of a crouch, gets him into the corner, wails away at him.
Yep. Well, and he was saying that anytime you got he was basically saying that anytime they were in the middle of the ring, which is where Roy was going to have the advantage because he was going to be faster and he was going to be more explosive. He basically said anytime Roy starts, like, first of all, make him lead because Roy doesn't want to lead. He wants to counter and use his speed to counter because he's a natural counter puncher. He's not an aggressive fighter, but he was like, make him lead because he wants to counter. So make him lead and then counter him when he goes to lead but be ready to move when he tries to punch back. And so when you watch Montel Griffin or Griffin during that fight, like it's not, it's not super entertaining overall in my opinion, but it doesn't really matter because Griffin is doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing and exactly what Eddie Futch told him to do. And he's not like taking rounds easily or anything like that. But you could see that Roy Jones is like, especially in what is this 97, I'm pretty sure. So during
Yeah.
this time, Roy was already dominant. He had already beaten Hopkins for his first belt. And then he had with the showdown with James Toney, which was considered like, oh shit, like James Toney's going to beat this guy's ass. And of course, there was stuff going on around or behind the scenes. Everybody knows that. But we're talking about the outlook before the fight. A lot of people thought James Toney was going to beat him. And basically, Roy Jones put a unholy whooping on him and dominated him to the point where people were like, "Oh shit!" So he was already dominant and a dominant figure after that too. And when they had seen him having difficulty with Montel Griffin, I think that was kind of eye opening. And you could see, like you said, Roy getting frustrated. He was just like he wasn't able to catch him clean. He couldn't quite, open him up and stuff like that. And Montel Griffin was a real pain in the ass. Speaking of James Toney, like those were not clean wins whatsoever, but he troubled the shit out of James Toney too.
He absolutely did. And Roy was, and like you said, Roy was getting touched more than we'd ever seen at that point. Like, even in the James Toney fight, he was untouchable and he was
If Griffin
flawless.
had power, he might have been in trouble.
Oh yeah, I mean, as we saw later on in Jones's career, if you were able to really, really touch him and get him in somewhere, you could hurt him. But Griffin, Roy had that problem, like you said. Anytime he would get in the corner, he would stand straight up, and Futch mentioned that. Roy didn't know how to fight in a corner and didn't know how to fight off the ropes. Ali would lean off the ropes and like try to use that to his advantage and do stuff. Roy would just
Roy would
kind of
just
stand
go,
straight up and yeah, and just try to cover up and do the quick counters. But like you said, Griffin would go over there and for a minute, he would be able to work the body because Roy would always have that open. He would drop that. Then you'd be able to loop in a couple of shots. And then he would get out of there before Roy was able to get him with a counter. Not every single time. Roy was catching him here and there and being able to time him. And as the rounds went on, Roy was getting more acclimated to it, but he was still
yeah,
struggling. Griffin was still giving him issues. And that was all Futch. Futch architected that. And that was the first time that we ever saw like Roy look human. And then you think about it, you're like, man, this old dude still got it. Like, like he was able to come up with this and come up with a game plan that worked for the first time. Roy didn't know what the fuck to do. And when you think about it, Roy probably felt like Ali did. Got this stupid ass little old guy over there messing with me over and just
yeah,
but
dude.
it was
Well, and
fascinating. I watched that live as a kid, and I remember watching that, and
I
I was
remember that. Yeah,
completely just like, man, just wow, wow, because I've never seen Roy get hit like that. I've never seen Roy get like outboxed in some pockets like that. And so when finally in round 9, when Griffin went down to a knee, because he was
he's
getting
getting
worn down.
touched.
He was. It was almost like, Roy was putting on pressure and pressure, and it was kind of like how Tank finally broke down Frank Martin this past weekend and like knocked him out. It was getting to that point too. Like, Roy was working him and there was only so much movement Griffin could do. And as he went down to a knee, that was more so him needing to take a break as opposed to like he was completely hurt. But
Which is
when
smart, you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like,
sure. But then Roy came and like, I can't stand you. How dare you make me look bad on and
it wasn't even that hard, but that's not the point. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't do it, dude. We've talked
no,
about Terry Norris so many times on the show, and that fool was like the hitting opponents while they're down master. I love him, but he did it like to damn near everybody, and it
yep,
was terrible. And in any case, point is, he
no
probably
pun
could have been,
intended.
what's that?
Said it was terrible. I said no pun intended because
He
Terry
probably
Norris.
could have been DQ'd like 5 more times, bro, for real. Like, not even kidding. But like, anyway, yeah, dude, Roy just happened to have, I guess, a referee, and in the position that he was, where they were like, nope, zero tolerance. And I mean, I can't really blame him. Griffin, yeah, he seemed as though he acted because he got caught, and then he like looked up at the ref and was like, man, or something like that. And then I'm like, no, dude, you don't do that. You don't talk. Come on, you don't talk first, you liar. But it doesn't matter. Again, you can't be hitting your opponent while they're down, especially twice. But point is, regardless of how you feel about that, it was a win for Montel Griffin. He
Yeah,
briefly held, a light heavyweight title, and that was in large part Eddie Futch, because he was part of that game plan that frustrated the shit out of Roy Jones and forced him into that position, basically.
it's true. And after that, Montel gets a big head. He thinks he was the one that did all the work himself, and for whatever reason, decides to fire Futch. I'm assuming there was some kind of
I mean,
disagreement.
would it have mattered? Probably not, but
Nah, nah.
it definitely didn't help. Tell you that much.
Seriously, I mean, Griffin really came out there really thinking he was, the man after that. And I get it. Anyone that can like, make Roy Jones look
He like
mortal.
talked himself into it, dude. It was bad.
Yeah. But everybody forgets too in that rematch. Roy looked really sloppy. I think he was so over anxious to get
Yeah,
him
he was
out.
so mad. He was just like, I'm just knocking this guy. He was swinging all over. Yeah.
He was. He got touched. I mean, like when I say he got touched, I mean like he just got hit with a few punches. Like he wasn't actually like hit really hard or his head snapped back or nothing. Like Griffith was able to hit him with a few shots because Roy was so wild in there. I never seen him that wild. It was until he landed that left hook that almost took his head off. That's when he like okay, But that was another one too. Kind of Futch was just like, I'm too old for this shit anyways. Like you want to go in there but not use me and think you're just gonna do whatever you want. Well, look at the results of that. And he's had that with other champions where he decided that he was going to be one and done with him. After the Griffin fight, he stopped working with him. He famously worked with Trevor Berbick for one fight where Berbick won the title against Pinklin Thomas. And he was completely just not happy with how that whole thing worked out, working with Berbick and how quirky that guy was and everything else around it and the circus atmosphere. So that when they try to bring him back for the Tyson fight, that or they asked him for that, he was like, "Nah, I'm good. Like I'm not gonna do that." He knew too what was gonna happen when that fight happened. He knew that Tyson he had no shot, so he was like, "I'm cool."
Yeah, and he wound up dying in 2001. That was only 4 years after that. His I guess his last great win, I suppose you could call it. But yeah, and I know I do remember when he passed away too that there was that kind of feeling that that was like an end of an era, or that was a
Oh,
lot of knowledge that was no longer being passed along.
absolutely. I mean, thank God he lived so long that we were able to record so many interviews with him and have his, insights on tape and other things like that. HBO did some miniseries on him, for fights when he had fighters featured and stuff like that. And so we're lucky in that regard. Same thing for Arcel for that matter. I mean, Arcel died in 94 and lived a little bit longer than Eddie Futch if you put him head to head. But like Arcel died in 94 and obviously like, pre-internet and everything like that. But he was recorded extensively and interviewed quite a bit and everything like that. So at least all that's still preserved.
Yeah, and I guess in some way too with Eddie Futch, I guess it's arguable, and we're happy to bring him up now, later, or not at all, whatever. But Freddie Roach, who Eddie Futch not
Right.
only trained as a fighter, but also apprenticed or took him on as an apprentice basically, and that's something too where I talked about like the lineaments and like the things like
Mhm.
that, and some people might be listening to or watching the show and going like, oh, I don't really know that much about the process of becoming a trainer or whatever, and perhaps you truly are interested. There might be people who really do want to become trainers, and I couldn't speak to exactly how it works all of the time now, especially because so many boxing gyms have become commercial and
Yeah.
chains and stuff like that. So it might be a totally different process where you need like a fucking degree or something. I don't know. But back in the day, that was not the case. And it was basically like you talked about Ray Arcel. You would essentially hang out in the gym. If you were accepted, great. And if you were accepted, at some point you might get lucky and they might say, hey, start cleaning up. Or
Mhm.
what I'm saying, like, and then you go from cleaning up to, hey, carry this bucket, hey, carry the towel, start wiping the guy down between rounds. Okay, what do you think? Let's watch the
Mhm.
film together, et cetera, where it kind of evolves into an apprenticeship where a trainer is learning from the elder trainer or the more senior trainer or whatever. And that's essentially what happened with Freddie Roach and Eddie Futch. Again, the end result is that's up to you because he seems slightly controversial, for Freddie Roach, that is, but nonetheless, at least there is some of that Freddie Roach, or I'm sorry, Eddie Futch knowledge being kind of passed along.
Oh, for sure. And it was interesting too. Freddie Roach became a trainer and broke off from Eddie Futch long before to the point where I think they actually were head to head a couple of times in fights. Like I think Freddie Roach was training Virgil Hill at that point, and then Futch was training. I don't know who he was training. I have to look back on it. Maybe James Kinchin or something. But
Yeah, it
like,
probably would have been Kinchin because he trained
yeah.
James Kinchin. Yeah.
So, but the couple of times, that was like the old head had to go against his young master. But Fel Torrance is another one who's still around. I don't know how active he is still in the game and stuff like that, but he was another Futch guy disciple. So they're
Yeah, I guess that there's at least on some level some of that knowledge being passed along, you know.
you would hope so. I mean, I know Freddie Roach definitely did, and a lot of stuff that Eddie Futch definitely influenced him for sure. And it
Yeah,
showed in his work. It
I,
definitely showed his work,
I
early
think
on.
Freddie Roach might have lost some of that knowledge when Alex Ariza kicked him in the fucking chest. That I'm just kidding. You remember that fucking shit?
Who can forget that whole fiasco back
That
then when
was so fucking
everything was so
weird.
ridiculous, man. Alex Ariza.
So
The
fucking
people that
weird.
were in boxing that you can forget about because they're not in the sport anymore, and then like you just kind of name drop them, and then you think back on that time period, and you're just like,
They're like in Macau, fucking Macau, and they're like brawling in some gym in Macau or something. Like, what the fuck are you guys doing,
And then like the
guys?
thing is, you would find exclusive footage of that on Setback's either boxing page or maybe on Boxing Talk, but you had to pay like a paywall to watch it. And eventually, the footage was end up on 24/7, so it becomes irrelevant. Who broke it first, anyways?
This
Like
fool's like fucking 65 years old with Parkinson's, and the fucking workout coach is coming up and doing Muay Thai kicks in the fucking chest. The fuck? So weird.
psychopath shit.
Like I
So
said, we're gonna talk about fun shit on the show.
yeah, and so like the next ones, I mean, these aren't all-time great trainers. I wouldn't even consider them great trainers, but I just think it's funny that you got to bring them up. And I'm not talking about Customato. I'm not talking even talking about Kevin Rooney. I'm talking about post Kevin Rooney, Mike Tyson's trainers. So there's a whole collection of them.
Yeah, he got with Freddie Roach for a minute too, actually. I mean, I don't know how much he actually
Oh, I'm not talking. Oh, yeah. I mean, exclude Freddie Roach. Okay.
well, and
Think
I'm not saying I don't think he really took, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he
I think he
basically
was
did
trained by
some
Jeff
pad
Bennett
work.
at one point too, but like after he breaks off with Kevin Rooney, this is the late 80s Mike Tyson, right? And Don King now is completely in his trenches, just has him by the hair. Yeah, just put his claws right in him and completely warped his mind. And that's a sad thing too, man, because Tyson at that point lost Customato. That was like his first father figure that he was just really just close with. And then he really gravitates after that to Jim Jacobs and Bill Caton to a lesser degree, but definitely Jim Jacobs. That was the one he looked upon as his dad and like his father and all that. And Jacobs had his best interest at heart. He really did. He wasn't a guy that was trying to like manipulate Mike or try to fuck him or nothing or yada yada yada. But after Jacobs dies in the late 80s of leukemia, um, unless I'm wrong on that, right? Did Jacobs try to fuck him?
No, no,
Oh.
I only make a face because there have been weird rumors in recent years about a lot of shit going on with Mike Tyson in his younger years. That's
Oh
all.
yeah, I've heard
But
that
like I
too.
said,
Yeah, yeah,
rumors.
yeah.
I don't know nothing.
Fair.
But I
But
think generally speaking, no, I think I agree with you. I agree with you.
yeah, but he was after that, Tyson was really lost. This is a dude who's the undisputed heavyweight champion, um, still kind of a man child, and now he's directionless. He has a wife who clearly does his is a maniac who just wants to take all of his money and doesn't give a shit about actually anything like that, and is
His
manipulating
life was very chaotic during this
very
time.
chaotic in the late 80s. It was bad. And like he just needed someone to try to like anybody that matter could have like kind of like brought him in and be like, here, man, let me give you a hug and I don't know, do what he did. And Don King, being the master manipulator that he was, saw that he was wounded, saw this as the biggest prize he could get, jumped in there, put his claws in, whatever. Tyson was never the same from that. So what I'm getting at is that the first thing he did was make sure that he turned after he gets his claws in, he made sure that he made Tyson turn his back on everybody
Yeah, he
that
like sued
was
everyone.
with him. Yeah,
Yeah, he like
Kevin.
took like everybody to court to like
Mhm.
bust fucking contracts and everything. Like chaos.
Everything was gone. Bill Caton was gone. Kevin Rooney was gone. Anything that had any type of association with Customato in his past, completely gone now. You know what I mean? Unless Tyson was going to go visit Customato's widow at their home, that was it. That was the only type of connection they would have. Don King was in full control now, and when Don King in control, he can pick and choose what Tyson's going to do, what he's going to act, what he's going to say, and who's going to train him. So that being said, the first guy that comes up, and I'm not going to knock him too much because I think he gets a bad rap, even though it's kind of a deserved one to a degree, is Aaron Snowell. You know, go ahead.
Yeah. Man, he definitely gets a bad rap. And I mean, kind of deservedly so, but it's not like his fault. You know, like he didn't react great, but he was set up to not do well either.
I mean, totally not. And like, it is the head trainer's responsibility, I would think, to like make sure you have all your shit in order before you go into the ring. But at the same time, if I'm the head trainer and you're the cut man, I'm gonna think if you're a cut man that you're gonna come in with all the proper tools that a cut man does. Like the head trainer's not the one with the end swell, is it? Isn't that a cut man thing?
I
Usually?
mean, I would imagine that the cut man should have their own shit. I mean, but
Yeah.
it yeah, well, they didn't really come in with any sort of fucking strategy or anything either, you know, so it's
Because it was Mike Tyson. He's
but
fighting
yeah, again, that's
Douglas
not
and
his fault. Like,
yeah.
you know.
But he does, to his credit on the HBO Legendary Nights documentary, and this might have been one of the first times he publicly spoke about it on camera like that. He takes full responsibility. He was like, you know what, I'm the head trainer. I made to make sure that everything was in order. I didn't do that in the first part, and I didn't make sure that everyone was accounted for. So he was like, hey man, it's my fuck up. And credit to him for saying that. But at the same time, they should have realized quickly that like you can't just go into the ring with a fucking rubber glove filled with water and a couple of things of ice that's going to dissolve after 3 rounds, and think that's going to stop any type of swelling. You can't put pressure on it because you just pressure on a water bag that's going like that. So anything is just like it's not working. Like it was an absolute clown show in that corner. But the only thing that kind of held them together was that like Snowell is not a bad trainer. He's a Don King lackey. One of those guys that I can't say Don King's the only one that has like trainers that was under his payroll. Back in the day, that was more of a common thing where trainers kind of worked under the thing. Look at the Duvas, for instance. Anyone who kind of joined their group back in the 80s into the early 90s, more or less was going to be trained by George Benton, Lou Duva, and George Benton and Lou Duva. And then
Yep.
after George Benton broke off, Ronnie Shields took that position, and so did Roger Bloodworth. So that was always the type of thing. You know what I mean? But Don King just had his set buddies that he would make sure was his trainers, and one of them, like we said, was Aaron Snow for that fight. But that whole story, everybody knows it. I mean, it was that fiasco and a disaster, and it took Snow a little bit of time, I guess, to build any type of credibility back. But people forget this about him, though. You know what I mean? Because the Tokyo disaster is so prevalent and such a big thing in history that people forget that even though he was a Don King house trainer, he still trained Frankie Randall when Randall beat Chavez the first time. He was his head trainer, and he was Randall's trainer for a number of years before that. He trained Tim Bradley when Tim Bradley knocked out Buelo Botelli for the IBF Bantamweight Championship. Like he was a good trainer.
Yeah, Tim Austin. Yeah, yeah.
Excuse me, Tim Austin, not Tim Bradley. Ugh. Yeah,
Yeah, Timmy Austin's one of those fighters who gets kind of lost in the shuffle of that time period. But he was a good fighter. You know, he's
very
a
good fighter,
probably would have been a fucking nightmare to fight just because of his dimensions, but he was a good fighter.
and a southpaw too, wasn't
Yep.
he? Yeah,
Fuck.
and he could
Yeah,
grab.
Snow gets kind of a bad rap, you know, like but the problem is that he also got a lot of mileage out of that, even just that appearance, because he didn't it wasn't a win obviously,
Sure.
and he's been on damn near every documentary they've done about both either Mike Tyson or Douglas Tyson, and I mean every single fucking time, bless the guy, but he drops that line about it was so quiet you could hear a rat piss on cotton every time. Like, bro, you gotta have a different line. I'm sorry. It's a great line, but it's only a great line like twice. And then after that, it's no good. And that's where he drops it every time. But point is, yeah, he gets remembered for it, dude. And he did go on to be a pretty decent trainer after that. But yeah, remembered definitely for that fiasco. And unfortunately, too, after that, probably the other trainer for Mike Tyson, that post Customato Kevin Rooney, is Jay Bright, who had associations with Customato and Kevin Rooney, but just didn't belong in that role. You know,
Not
like,
at all. Not at all, man. He was inept as shit in the corner. I'm sorry, bro. Like he just
yeah, I'm not trying to be mean, but he did not belong in that role.
no, and everyone said it too back then. That was like when Tyson came back after he went to jail. Snow was out at that point, and then Tyson, like I said, at this point, he brings in Jay Bright, like a D'Amato disciple. as they called him. And he was interviewed a bunch of times. Like I said, he was another guy too. And at any time Tyson brought in a new trainer, obviously that guy was going to get publicity because you want to know his backstory if he's not really well known and all that other stuff, right? So he was interviewed for Ring Magazine. I can still see his face right there. He's like smiling and talking about how he worked with D'Amato and all this other shit and whatever. But like like all those type of guys, man, maybe the like the punch combinations on the heavy bag, 4.5, 2.7, 18, 98, I don't know, 45 or whatever, things that'd be yelling in the corner for you, 7, 18, 24. Like you can yell all that shit, but you be an actual trainer and implementing, giving you a game plan instead of just yelling all combos of two different things. And like Bright wasn't, like you said, was not a guy that was supposed to be for that job. And if you look at Tyson's early fights when Bright was in that corner for him, when he first comes back, and I'm not talking about the McNeely fight, because even then Tyson just looked rusty and sloppy, but you can just attribute that, be like, okay, he was excited. It was 4 years off and some jitters, whatever it may be. He didn't look good against Buster Mathis at all.
You're talking like Mike now.
Yeah, he didn't. He looked very rusty against Buster Mathis and was getting outboxed before he finished him off. Frank Bruno was petrified, but I mean, if you watch that back too, Tyson just there was something off with him, and he didn't have the right trainer to really like try to fine tune whatever was going to be off. Maybe it was going to be completely gone no matter what, but at least he could have been with somebody that would have been more in tune to like help him as opposed to just being like, one of those guys that like, okay, I'm a D'Amato associate and probably looked at Mike in more of an awe than he did as a person that can just
Right.
like,
Yeah. And that was fuck, dude, has there ever been a time in Mike Tyson's life beyond the most recent years where there wasn't chaotic? Because it was chaotic at that point too. Like he
oh my
said that
God, yeah.
he was doing a lot of drugs and like, still doing a lot of shit and fucking and you could just see it in the ring. This was during the time when he was basically fouling every single fighter that he came into contact with. And, well, he was suspended for a few years and couldn't fight. And so when he had or maybe a year or whatever. And then when he had come back, it was like every single fight he had, there was some sort of in-ring fiasco, trying to break somebody's arm, trying to fucking, injure somebody or whatever, like Savarese going after Lou Savarese, even though the fucking poor referee's trying to get between him and he's like punching the ref. There was something in every single fucking time. And so he needed somebody, obviously, who was going to be like, hey, cut the shit, not somebody who was just going to play into his shit, which seemed like Jay Bright was pretty much doing.
Oh, totally, man. It was not good. And like it really came to a head, obviously, when Tyson fought Holyfield, because they had no answers for it. They had no answers for everything that happened in that fight. Holyfield just undressed him and took him apart. And in one of the best, most inspired performances of that decade, if not ever, Holyfield stops him. That was a huge upset. I mean, that was
People forget how big an upset that was.
I mean, bro, people thought Holyfield was gonna die in that fight.
Well, and
Like
now, of course, it seems so like elementary. People are like, "Well, of course, Holyfield was going to whoop his ass." It's like that's not what people were saying at the time, yo. Like,
oh,
you
like
might remember it that way, but that's not the case.
like I don't think it was really like put out in public that Holyfield had suffered from hepatitis after the bullfight, the third bullfight, and the way like his energy shifts happened and that and how he got stopped and George Foreman thinking he was gonna die over and over in that fight.
Yeah,
And and uh then he looked like shit against Bobby Ches.
yep,
So,
yeah,
it's
dude. Ches was clipping him. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah. And so everyone, I guess, was rightly to think that Tyson was going to whoop him. I was a kid. I told you this, and I've said this on the show before. I was a kid, and I thought that I thought that Holyfield would win. And I said, and my only logical reason was if Holyfield can go 4 rounds, he wins. Because I just thought Tyson ain't going to know what to do after because he hasn't been that long in too many years. All right. That was my 12-year-old mind saying that, and well, I got correct. But um, Tyson's corner did not help him that night. If he had anybody, even the dudes who trained him later on, like, for a cup of coffee, like Freddie Roach or Tommy Brooks, who was definitely there for a little bit near the end, who was a very good trainer himself. Or what's his name there?
Ronnie
Jeff
Shields.
Fetch. Ronnie Shields. Ronnie Shields did train him, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, one of those guys. No, you got Jay Bright and a bunch
but
of other.
but it was all each of them was for like a fight or something.
Sure, but
Like
I'm
yeah,
just saying any of those guys would have been better in his corner that night than what he had. You know what I mean? So that ends up screwing up. But then from there afterwards, now he gets a guy who's a veteran, but still with an extremely sketchy past to help him for the Holyfield rematch. And that's another Don King associate, maybe the oldest Don King associate when you think about it, Richie Giacchetti.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely. I don't really think there's necessarily anything wrong with Richie Giachetti in
No,
general, because especially because he had his own associations with Larry Holmes. Even though I don't know that
it,
he, I don't know how much a fighter like Larry Holmes was necessarily picking up in the gym from Richie Giachetti. All due respect, but I mean, Larry Holmes is more a fighter who was forged in the gym from other fighters. You know what I'm saying? Like being a sparring partner for Ali very early in his career, being a high level amateur, etc. You know, so he wasn't like necessarily learning shit from Richie Giachetti, but yes, without any question, that Richie Giachetti was kind of moving forward was you know kind of a Don King guy.
yeah, definitely a Don King guy. Way before King got into boxing, in fact, too, because both of them were running the streets together doing a bunch of shit. King doing his numbers game, Giacchetti. I'm looking at his chapter right now in this book, and it's like he was definitely up to a lot of stuff to the point where one time I believe his nickname on the street by cops nonetheless was called the Flame. And the reason why they called him the Flame was that whenever random arsons happened, Giacchetti just happened to be a few blocks around or somewhere near it anytime something like that would go down. So
It
make
didn't seem like he was a fast runner. So I mean,
so make your own conclusions from that. All right, you see a random fire happening in a field somewhere or at a house, and then the cops go investigate. And 2 blocks over, you see Giacchetti on a corner smoking a cigarette. So I don't know, but these two guys eventually they get into the sport. Giacchetti was known as a very, very tough street fighter himself, like a dude strictly from the streets, knew how to take care of himself. Um, and he was a car person. I think that's what he did. He worked in like mechanics and did a lot of type of stuff like that. And like you said, general know-how. Looking right here, they said that not only besides Larry Holmes, he worked with Aaron Pryor. I could see that association. Esteban de Jesus, that's a king fighter, and back then I could see that. Greg Page, same thing. Julian Jackson, and Buster Douglas. So
there you
he
go.
he was one of those dudes that like yeah he was very rotund, um had like this green he just looked like a shady character, you know what I mean, like you just knew he was something that was just like a little off kilter with him. But his biggest association, yes, was like Larry Holmes early, like not early in Holmes's career, but I think he took over after Holmes was broken off with Ernie Butler, Ernie Butler, his original trainer. So I think Giacchetti might have taken over being King's guy from there, and then eventually he was with Giacchetti for a number of years until Eddie Futch came in for a bit. And then Holmes went back to Giacchetti for a minute.
Yeah, it was like I want to say like not too long after he won the title, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But point is, yeah, he had worked with Holmes, and that was kind of where he had gotten his name or whatever. Or at least, yeah, I mean, you're associated with the heavyweight champion.
Sure.
Makes sense. But I
But
mean,
you know what's funny about him though too is that in training for the Holyfield rematch, I remember in like a lot of pre like tape things, Giacchetti was talking about how they were gonna like do some secret training and go back to roots, and you're just gonna see a whole different Mike that you've never seen before. And there was a couple of times the cameras are rolling and Giacchetti got the patch. He's like, "All right, guys, time to leave. We gotta work on our secret stuff now. The one that you're not, you're gonna see only on fight night. Just get ready." Like then you see them like close the doors and shut it down and all that, and you're like, "Oh boy, wonder what Tyson's working on with his guru." And then you go in there round one, he comes out jabbing and moving, and you're just like, "Wait, what?" Because remember how he came out kind of like quiet in the first round and wasn't really doing a whole ton. Just Holyfield was dictating more than Mike trying to be reckless, and then he gets cut, and well, all hell breaks loose. And then Giacchetti, I think, at one point gets in a ring and he gets knocked around, and the guy's so big that he's barely being able to keep his balance through the fucking fiasco that was unfolding.
it was such a fucking fiasco, bro. And it was basically just like, oh man, yeah. And it was obviously bad news from the start, but yeah, Holyfield was headbutting the shit out of Mike Tyson. And some of them Mike was kind of initiating as well, but it was, dude, come on.
But the
Yeah.
way I feel bad for Tyson. He was like, "Look at me, man! I gotta go hunt my kids looking like this."
Yeah, I don't know how much he actually fucking cared about that, but nonetheless,
I'm saying,
he did get headbutted to shit though. I'm not gonna lie about that. He got headbutted to fucking shit.
But
for sure.
yeah, we had to bring up Tyson's late 90s fiasco trainers.
Yeah, at that point, it's, from that point forward, he wasn't really a serious fighter. Like you said, we've all these hired guns, these other trainers who were brought in to train him, where, it's almost like not even fair to like associate, them with Mike Tyson at this point, because they
Yeah.
almost all did stuff way better than that.
You know what would have been an interesting matchup though? Not like pairing. Tyson and Emmanuel Stewart.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, Manny Manuel Stewart might have been able to actually, nobody was going to be able to rein Mike Tyson in, but at least in the ring, he might have been able to actually discipline him enough to do something.
I think so, man. I mean, like they had history together. I know, through the amateur system and stuff, they definitely knew each other. But like, that would have been interesting. I think his style would have been good for Stewart because like Stewart knows how to work with those aggressive guys and like so.
Well, we have to talk about another Mike Tyson associated trainer, just
Okay.
because it's somebody who's famous to this day. Although he doesn't really have a whole lot of boxing association, he spends more of his time shitting on boxing and fucking stroking on UFC and MMA than anything. That's Teddy Atlas.
Oh.
You
Hmm.
know, like I said, one of the very first things I said was that we're probably not going to spend a lot of time shitting on trainers and talking about bad trainers. We'll probably bring some shit up. In the case of Teddy Atlas, I will. In the case of Teddy Atlas, I will. You know, I don't know too much about Teddy Atlas and his upbringing or any of that type of stuff, so I don't really give a shit about that. I'm not gonna like malign the guy's family. No, I'm just talking purely training from a training perspective. That's it. And so basically, the whole thing is that he was an apprentice to Cus D'Amato and was able to kind of latch on to Mike Tyson and part of the fame. And he did in fairness, he did do a lot of hands-on training with Mike Tyson when Tyson was an amateur and when he was pretty young. Although when you kind of word it like that, it's kind of funny to think about. It's like, oh, his whole experience is training like a 14-year-old Mike Tyson. Still, that's pretty funny. But he was able to kind of market himself very well. And he worked with like Charlie Weir, for instance, was a fighter that he worked with. And he was able, what's that?
South African?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, the dude with the funny hair with the
So yeah.
yeah, with that silver like just out
Mhm.
patch in the front of his
Yeah.
head. Yeah, like, and he had worked with a host of fighters, Tracy Harris Patterson. He had worked with a whole bunch. Well, and of course, to be fair, Customato, Floyd Patterson, Tracy Harris Patterson. So there were a lot of kind of associations, but like I said, he was in some ways lucky to have these associations and also get work off of these prior associations. But during the 90s, he did have a number of fighters that he trained or worked with that did do a lot of very good work. But notably Michael Moore, of course, because as we've kind of gone through a handful of times already on this episode, when you have an association with the heavyweight champion, training the heavyweight champion, etc., that counts for quite a bit. And so, in any case, for Teddy Atlas, beyond that, it gets kind of sketchy, dude, because there's a lot of kind of like one off type of stuff. There's a lot of training of fighters where like relationships just went very poorly, or like, that kind of went like this, like, "Ooh, ah," like down off a fucking cliff where he'd have some success. And then all of a sudden the fighter would like want nothing to fucking do with him and hate him because he was a lunatic. And that's what wound up happening. Basically, the only fighter that I know of or that I can think of off of the top of my head that doesn't have like a bad relationship with him now or doesn't like hate him is Tim Bradley, because Tim Bradley's his own fucking lunatic, to be honest. But, you know,
They
almost
definitely
everybody
match
else.
each other's energy.
What's that?
But they definitely match each other's energy.
Yeah, they're both weird, bro. And they both go off on some shit. But he had fallings out with just about everybody else for one reason or another. A lot of it for money, a lot of it for kind of like a number of different fighters have said that they felt he was trying to get the attention, basically, that he was trying to make the shit about him, etc. So Yeah, I mean, I had to bring him up, dude, especially because of what he's turned into in recent years, where he used to be somebody who was seen as like a crusader for justice in boxing, and now he's literally the exact opposite. Up there shilling for
Yeah.
fucking for his excellency and shit. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm like, yo, that's Teddy Atlas is doing that now, huh? All right.
So, like Teddy Atlas is an interesting case because, like you said, he worked with a number of fighters before he got to Michael Moore. Another one too, where he had major falling out, where I think he threatened to kill him, or he said he wanted to in his book. It was Donnie Lalonde,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's another
Jesus.
that's a whole other story in itself. So yeah, Teddy doesn't have a lot. He burns bridges easily. He's a very passionate man, and he
And that came out while he was working for ESPN and was like that
right,
whole
yeah, that was a crazy book. And I remember they interviewed Lalonde about it too. And Lalonde's a shady character himself for a lot of his out of the ring issue, a lot of his out of ring activities. But he did basically he was like, yeah, Teddy's a psychopath. He was like, I didn't do anything. And if I don't remember the exact details of it, but if you look at it, it's more Teddy just being more like sour grapes and pissed off than Lalonde doing anything. You know what I mean? But
So if I may, like
yeah,
I'll it's
please,
because I remember and also because I was reading about this not long ago, even apart from doing this episode. But long story short, Donnie Lalonde, he was an advocate for like, child abuse and stuff like that coming up. And he was a big outspoken advocate for like taking care of kids and like, being anti-abuse and speaking up for it and stuff like that. And that only ties into this because I think that from like a psychological perspective, he focused a lot on that type of stuff, on like his mental well-being and etc. And so, long story short, what Donnie Lalonde had said was that while Teddy Atlas was his trainer, that Lalonde had gotten injured a handful of times, and that Teddy was like basically saying like suck it up, be a man, stop being a bitch, fight through it and shit like that. And Donnie Lalonde was like, no, like I have a legitimate like actual injury and I can't do that. And Teddy Atlas was like ignoring him according to him. And that so Donnie Lalonde and his team had decided like, we need to move on. So they only worked together for like a fight or two. And that after he moved on and decided to like sack Teddy Atlas literally went and got a gun and then waited outside of Donnie Lalonde's apartment. And when Donnie Lalonde never showed up or never came out, Teddy left. And that he
Mhm.
like the next day was like psycho calling his apartment and asking where he was. And then finally, when his girlfriend answered and said, yeah, he's here, he got his gun, marched over there, and magically on the way there decided he didn't want to do it. And so but then makes a big point in his book to say, if he was there that day, he was dead. That was actually a pretty good Teddy Atlas impression.
That was a very good one.
But
I've been
but
around the
he's
guy plenty
he like
enough
repeats it
times. I know him.
fucking like he like repeats it in the book. He's like, I was gonna kill him. He's dead. Oh, and it's like, dude, you're writing this down. What the fuck? And so yeah, that they talked to Lalonde after that. They were like, yeah, that sounds about right because he's fucking crazy. And that's pretty much what every fighter he's worked with has said.
Well, when he fought Michael Moore, when he took over Michael Moore's training, I think what was it? Was his first fight the Holyfield fight?
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know. I know Michael Moore has also had a lot of falling outs in his career too.
He is. I mean, they're both just very like difficult personalities. So the fact that they were able to have the fights that they had together was
Right. So
incredible in itself.
speaking
Yeah.
fairly here.
So Holyfield at that point, like you said, he had left main events and he's on his way. And then we got for that corner, it was Teddy Atlas. And I want to say Lou Duva was in that corner too, which is crazy. Imagine those 1-2 as a dynamic. But Duva was the one that was more composed. I don't think he was going absolutely crazy. I think he let Teddy be the voice of reason, which
He
was,
seemed to kind of take a back seat when there was like a more experienced trainer in the corner. He kind of like back up.
sure. And I think he knew that Teddy was the head trainer and he was just kind of more there and stuff. But Duva liking to be loud and braggadocious and always just yelling stuff himself. He even seemed to be more reserved in that role too, because Teddy was going absolutely ape shit that Duva was like, I don't need to yell. This guy's doing it all for me. But that was the main thing is that like Moore at that point, he wasn't the ferocious light heavyweight that we all remember. Like he went out there and the guy that was just like tearing everybody up and probably doing it because he was like weight drained and pissed off and just always violent and angry. But then as he becomes a heavyweight, he still has that mentality early on to a degree until he fights Burt Cooper. And then when like he goes to hell and back with Cooper, almost something slightly changed in him where he realized, you know what, I don't want to go to hell and back with these guys and just get knocked around and have a Foreman lie out every type of fight. I mean, it's not good for anybody's career anyways. And
Time to
so
whip out my southpaw.
yeah, he just started becoming a more reserved guy who it looked like, you weren't. I mean, like Holyfield was there to be taken in that first fight, clearly. But like at that same point, you wanted to know if Moore really just had enough that he was going to push himself to really do it. And that point, and that's the thing that made that fight so fascinating. Not that it was a really great fight, but that like Moore had to be pushed. Like he gets dropped, I think, in the second round. Atlas starts freaking out over at that point. But then like little parts over when he just gets a little flat, Atlas starts, like you said, he starts going on these crazy things, taking over, sitting down in the chair. You want me to go out there instead? Or what's the other one? He grabs who was the referee for that fight? Was it Mills Lane? Or who?
I'd have to look, but it was somebody who was like known. Yeah.
Yeah, and he goes over and grabs the referee's hand. I wonder how that referee must have felt about that, suddenly being pulled during the middle of in between rounds. What the fuck? Charlie tried to grab the judge's
It's
scorecard,
just
something
making
like
a
that.
big
Like,
fucking dramatic thing about it.
drags him over to the corner. I swear to God, I will stop this fight right now. If you don't decide, if you don't decide fight, I will tell this referee. Do you hear me? And the referee's just like, "Can I go now?" Like,
He's like, let go of me. What the fuck, bro?
yeah, like, seriously, what does it matter? You want me to fucking fine y'all? And then,
Michael, I got your kid on the phone. He's on the phone right here. He wants to talk to you. He wants to know why daddy's not wanting to win the heavyweight title. Why doesn't he want to be champion, Michael? It's like, bro, this
and
guy's
so,
in a fight right now. What the fuck?
and this is the 90s, and everybody's in love with that type of drama shit that you see unfolding in a corner and all this building up. And so, of course, Teddy Atlas becomes as big of a star as Michael Moore. Michael Moore is not a big personality, anyways. He's very low key, angry, surly, not a really good interview, and not the most pleasant individual to be around back then. You know what I mean? Like he can force a smile and stuff like that, but you'd be hard pressed to get more than 5 words out of him for a quote. So Teddy Atlas was perfect for him. He's the guy that can scream and talk and be all
Exactly.
out and and if they're going to be together, he can be the
Getting
star of the
George
show.
Foreman's face.
Yeah, yes, yes. So stupid. Like he's lucky for that wasn't '70s Foreman who would have absolutely pancaked him and put him in the hospital, just flattened him right there. Instead, this was Foreman who just kind of looked, who was annoyed. You can tell Foreman was
You could
annoyed.
tell that he was kind of close to like getting like,
Yeah,
oh, okay, really? Like you could kind of tell just for a sec he was like,
but Foreman was so like cool about it. He still just stood forward. He was like, wasn't even looking at him. He was just like, sit down and get me a sandwich. Sit down and go make me a burger. And he's just staring ahead. Sit down and make me a sandwich. Like, bro, don't make him stand up and actually get in your face because he's gonna take you and just destroy you. And the same thing in that fight. Like Atlas was more reserved in the Foreman fight because he didn't have to. He didn't have to like go to theatrics because Foreman was so slow and ponderous that like Moore could just outbox him without really going himself into the next gear. But Atlas at the same, I'll give him this. All right, he was telling Moore in that fight. He wasn't. He was trying to give him the right advice. Stop walking into his right hand. Stop walking into that direction. He's trying to set you up. Stop getting lazy. Keep your mind on the fight. Like you're winning, but you just stop. You know what I mean? Like he's clearly trying to do something here, and Moore just sleepwalked right into that, and that was it. And Atlas, like you said, but I don't think he still remained a personality, but he never really regained those heights again. He still had a couple of fights with Moore where he completely lost his shit with him. Um, which ones? The Axel Schultz fight was one, right? And the Botha fight. Botha
yeah,
fight was another where
yeah.
he really had to push him because that was a fight too where like a guy like Franz Botha should not be outboxing a Michael Moore and outworking him. And I love Botha, right? He was a guy that but Botha was an overachiever, man. Even though he was a
he
dude
was
who played
he was actually a good fighter. It was he came
yes.
along at the wrong time.
And not only that, but like, he was one of those guys that like when he first got a title shot and he had one of those ridiculously inflated records, everyone thought he was just a fucking cream puff. And when he got the decision over Schultz in a fight that he probably shouldn't have gotten that decision on, same thing. Like, oh, what the fuck is that? But like you said, he proved his wealth over the years, man. Even if he didn't win all the big ones, he was a tough as nails dude. We all love
Did he
Mike.
have associations at all with Cedric?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, he did. I think
Hmm.
that's how he got the title fight originally.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he did. But like, I don't think he after he won it or something like that. I'm assuming he moved on. But Botha was an interesting cat, man. The crew that he carried around, I guess he ran around the same circles as Mike Tyson's crew, which is interesting in itself. And so, but you would always see like what was his trainer, Stacy something? Um, Not Stacy McKinley.
Sure.
No, something Sterling McPherson. You
There
would
you
see
go.
Sterling McPherson, who was a loud personality himself, and a bunch of other Tyson lackeys or other Don King hangers around. You would see both are usually in a mink coat and some sunglasses or some shit. But anyways, back to Atlas. Yeah, after he left Michael Moore, he comes up with Shannon Briggs. And that was like, remember that was a big thing too, because Briggs was supposed to be the next great heavyweight. And
And
when
he
he
was
got
from, I'm pretty sure he's from Brownsville too, isn't he?
yes. Mhm.
Yeah, so
Yep.
it was kind of like that was the whole association. Like, well, Teddy Atlas started with Mike Tyson, and now he's got his other, the new.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if memory serves me correct, Briggs was the only one to get a feature on HBO that night for the night of the young heavyweights. No one, Tua didn't get one, Galata didn't get one. That was only Briggs, and Briggs is the one that gets knocked out. So that's another thing. After Briggs gets knocked out, Teddy leaves him. And I don't know, what was he working with at that point? I think he just kind of like fizzled for a minute, didn't he? Or just kind of
Dude, he was with a whole. He was actually worked with a whole bunch of fighters in the late '90s and like early 2000s. There was a
oh,
bunch. It
okay.
was just that he fucking like Kirk Johnson. He was with Kirk Johnson for a bit.
I think I remember that. Oh,
He was with Kirk Johnson for well. There's even on box recs right here, but he was with Kirk Johnson for a bit. He was with that. Well, this was a couple years before that, actually. Joey Gamache, but let's see. Oh my God, Wilfred Benitez. I don't even want to look at that one.
wait, what? Oh
That's what
no.
it says. I'm gonna have it says late Benitez career, and I'm like, I'm not going there. I'm
Yeah.
not touching that. Christoph Tiozzo,
Okay.
obviously Donnie Lalonde, etc. So I mean, like, dude, there was some fighters he was working with. Michael Grant too. Yeah, that's right.
That's
Michael
right. I forgot
Michael
about
Grant
that.
was probably the next like big one. But dude, it's so weird. Was it just coincidence that Teddy just happened to work with all of these fighters who had like I'm not trying to how do you say this without being a dickhead these days? Like head issues? Like or like confidence issues, I guess you could say, where
I would
they
say confidence issues, definitely, because Teddy was looked at as one of those motivator types. That's what he was.
or
He was
or was it that he was kind of an asshole and making confidence issues worse? Because
well,
it kind
yeah.
of seems that way to me with like, looking back.
I agree with you, man. Like it was definitely he was definitely looked at as like a motivator because what he did with Moore, everything I think was really based off what he did with Moore in that first Holyfield fight because he put on a show just as Moore did. Moore scraped by and won the fight, but like Atlas pushing him on and yelling and screaming and doing all these things in the corner built that up to where everyone thinks that if he didn't do that, Moore would have been knocked out at some point or he wouldn't have won it.
Yeah.
So Atlas built that reputation off of that, kind of kept that same thing because he knew once he had it, you just go with it. And then like it yeah, it didn't work for some. And so like Michael Grant going with Atlas, that was definitely I need a confidence booster because fucking Grant got splattered by Lennox Lewis before that. Splattered. Madison Square Garden pay-per-view, everybody saw that. The world was watching that one because Grant was supposed to be coronated as the next great heavyweight that night. And Lewis solidly, emphatically shut that down quickly. He was like, fuck you. So that ends. And as that happens, whatchamacallit, he yeah, that was more I think that was like the storyline going into that first fight, his comeback fight with Jameel McCline. He's working with Teddy Atlas and he's getting his confidence back and he's gonna do this and that and blah blah. And instead, unfortunately, first thing that happens, he gets charged. McCline goes bum rushing out of a corner like a wild bull, lands up the first punch he throws. Grant goes down, breaks his ankle in the process. Unfortunately, like can't ask for worse luck than that.
And it was so wild too because that was right around the exact same time that shit happened to Tacumbo Elijah Day. You remember that shit?
Yeah. Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
So I
yeah.
remember that shit happening and being like, "What the fuck? What's wrong with these guys' ankles?"
And I
But
remember
yeah,
my
dude, I
dad
remember that
always
shit.
telling me too when guys would get knocked out and you see their legs, he would be like, "Oh my god, he's so lucky his leg didn't break." Because dudes, when they get knocked out violently, or if they get dropped, sometimes especially a big ass guy like Grant. Grant's a massive individual.
Yeah,
If
like
he
the
fights
feet
a
are
certain way,
planted, but the rest of the body's going,
exactly. If his feet aren't fully planted, the rest of his body goes there and his ankle gets bent a certain way, I'm sorry, that shit's gonna pop. Like, there's no way that's not
Yeah,
going
it's
to.
like 200 pounds of human
Yeah.
that's going burp.
And
Yeah.
that's unfortunate. That
Uh,
was a freak accident, and that derailed their career together. And I think he stood with Grant actually, right, for a
I
couple of
think he was
fights.
with him until the, what was it, Dominic
Dominic
Gwynn?
Gwynn. Oh, yeah, that was bad too, man. Gwynn beat
And then on top of that, he made everybody think Dominic Gwynn was somebody. So we all were fooled
yes.
for a minute. God damn
The
it.
man, all right, man. One of the
So
our buddy
frustrating.
Gray, our buddy Gray brought a Ring magazine during Hall of Fame weekend over that I totally forgot about. And on the cover of it was Audley Harrison, Dominic Gwynn, and Joe Macy. And they were saying who's gonna be the next great heavyweight. And I'm just like, is that how bad that ever like the early 2000s were for heavyweights? Like,
Yeah, they were
geez,
like, oh, this guy's was the super heavyweight gold medalist. He must be good. He wasn't.
no.
Oddly Harrison wasn't good. Sorry.
And
Yeah.
Dominic Gwynn became an absolute journeyman who beat Audley Harrison at some point. And
Yeah.
Macy, well, Macy, we all know about that. But you know, from Atlas after that, I mean, he becomes the television commentator too for ESPN, and that was the main thing, right? So everybody's
Yeah.
watching that shit
The
and like
grandstanding just got taken to the fucking max.
exactly. And yeah, that's when like the memes started coming in and all these other things. But like even then, like knucklehead decisions that are still like you would look back at over 20 something years now and it's like a head scratcher is because like Atlas was still training guys. He was much more like kind of semi-retired from training because he was, all of his duties were with ESPN at that point, but he still had a couple of guys if he felt worthy of training him.
Yep.
And they were usually unknown dudes. So Elvin Murky is what I'm bringing up
Yep.
right now.
Kosovo kid.
And
That's right.
yeah, in the late 90s, early 2000s,
He
because of
was
where he
he was
came
a
from.
Golden Gloves champion too.
Yeah, from the New York area. It wasn't a bad fighter. He was a good dude.
Yeah, he just didn't pan out as a pro.
Sure. But, he was getting a lot of publicity early on, and mostly from the Teddy Association, and also to Kosovo War, where he
Yep.
came from, Brooklyn, all that other stuff. Like, he had a good story. And I remember one time that Teddy was going to make history because he was going to do commentating and train his dude at the same time,
Yep.
fighting
That's
security.
right. Was
He
that
was
the Sam Ahmad fight?
no, because he won that fight. It was like Scott
Yeah,
Lopez or
shit was like
something.
an
I don't know.
unnecessary war.
Yeah, and like he goes, he commented like round one starts, he's over there, and then he goes back. Yeah, there's my guy. Blah, 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 blah. Round two, he goes in the corner, runs up. There's
Classic
Teddy over
Teddy
there in the corner.
bullshit.
Yeah, and then unfortunately, Mariki got his ass kicked that fight and lost in an upset. So like it clearly didn't work, but like it was the sporadic thing. The last thing he did, I guess, like you said, was being with Tim Bradley and talking about firemen and stuff like that. But like, man, Teddy is just one of those he's an interesting figure in the sense that like a lot of people have fond memories of him and find him funny and be like, oh yeah, but in terms of you really think about it, I don't know if you call him an absolute genius of the sport or one of those guys I would put on the same pedestal as Arcel, as Futch, as even Gil Clancy or people like that. You know what I mean?
No, 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 not even close.
Yeah.
I know some people might think that, and that's kind of like the recency bias or whatever, but no. Um, I mean, I think that a lot of it was, especially around this time that we're talking about in like the 2000s or whatever, he did a handful of things that were really just kind of like, for instance, one time, like, one of those fights, he was really like shitting on Mariki really good, like into the mic. And then I remember one time where on ESPN, Michael Moore fought, don't remember who he fought, but he fought somebody, looked rusty, and literally Teddy Atlas came up into the ring as he's getting interviewed in the fucking post fight and was like basically bullying Michael Moore into saying that he needed to retire. And Michael Moore kind of like, reluctantly agreed. And so then like there were even fucking websites that were like, Michael Moore is retiring. And then like a day later, Michael Moore is doing interviews where he's like, no, I'm not fucking retiring. I just wanted Teddy to get out of my fucking face. Like,
That was
because
the early.
he like
Go ahead.
just fought and he like won and Teddy's in his face going like, yeah, come on. I don't think you look good. Come on, you got to agree. You should retire. I think it's time to retire. Come on, you got to do it. And Michael Moore, like somewhat soft spoken, at least compared to Teddy Atlas, is like, okay, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's like whatever, bro. I guess yeah, you need to have thick skin, but at the same time, you don't want somebody who is like in that position, coming in and just fucking emasculating your ass on fucking live TV like that. And that's not the first time that he did that shit. And it wasn't the last time either. So it's just kind of like, it doesn't look super good. And I'm sure, is he already in the Hall of Fame? Because if he's not,
Petty?
I'm sure he will be. If he's not,
Pretty sure he is.
I'm
I'd have to check.
positive that
Yeah,
if he's not now, he will be. But
absolutely.
my whole point in bringing him up is that, like, I'm not trying to just crap on the guy, but he's done a lot of stuff as a trainer that is just not cool. Oh,
Sure.
and remember Povetkin, because he's training Povetkin, and
Oh yeah, that's
Povetkin was
right. He did
lined up
train.
for the fucking
Yeah.
shot at Klitschko, and Teddy was like, "No, no, we're not taking that shot. He's not ready. He's not ready as a fighter. He's not a very good fighter right now." And it's like, dude, if I were Povetkin, I would have been like, dude, what?
Oh, yeah.
What the fuck, dude? And so he held him back for like 2 years or something, bro. Wild, crazy, dumb.
I liked him as an analyst, and especially in the early days for ESPN because he
He
was
spoke up in a
reflective on that.
lot of situations where others wouldn't. I'll give him
Oh,
that.
absolutely. I mean, before he became a caricature of himself, he was a good analyst, and the way he would, and especially when he was calm and he wasn't like losing his mind about things, like he was just giving normal analysis of how a fight was breaking down and calling, Mr. So and so and da da da. But like, it was good. Like, he was a good thing with Bob Papa and stuff like that. But like, yeah, I don't Teddy, you know. We got time for one more, you think?
Yeah.
All right, yeah. And so, uh, trying to think who would it be.
You got to put water in the recliner.
Yeah,
You do the body shots. You do fuck.
I mean, we've talked about him. Actually, the next dude we can bring up would be Gil Clancy because I don't think we really talked about him a ton of times on the show before.
Not a whole lot. And there's definitely a mixed bag there.
Sure, Clancy was one of those dudes again, man. A long career, especially in the New York area. A guy who not only with the world champions he worked for, but I mean, like he had a countless contenders and other ones that he worked, out here, basically staying out of New York. But like you said too, carried a lot of hats in boxing. Not only was he a world class trainer, he became the head matchmaker, taking over for Teddy Brenner actually at Madison Square Garden, which during that time was a very prestigious job because MSG was the mecca. You know what I mean? When it came to that. So if you're going to be the head matchmaker, taking care of all those shows, weekly shows that they're putting on an MSG, not only just the main of the big cards, but the other cards and all this type of shit. Like that was a very time consuming job. And then on top of that too, he became an expert analyst. I think it was for CBS.
Yeah.
Yeah, with
Yes. Yeah.
Ryan, CBS,
Well,
Tim
he
Ryan, and
did
Gil Clancy,
later on. He was with HBO too,
but
but yeah, I
HBO.
think it was with
Yeah,
CBS initially.
yep. So
Yeah, and he actually, I didn't even realize that he died in like the 2010s. You know what I'm saying?
I had a chance to meet him a couple of times.
I
He was in the
never,
Hall
I
of Fame.
never,
Yeah.
I never met him or knew him, but I just thought he had died earlier. To be honest, I didn't realize he had died that late. But yeah, his time goes way back, and he's one of those dudes who seemed like he was like 55 years old, like even back in the day. You know what
Always
I'm
looked
saying?
very old, didn't he? Yeah.
He was an old looking guy, but we've talked about this too earlier where like motherfuckers did not age the same way back in the day. They just didn't. I mean, shit, if it weren't for this awful gray
Sure.
beard, I'm 42, bro. But anyway, point being, yeah, dude, he goes back a long way. And part of his, not his start in boxing, but his start as far as getting recognized, his kind of acknowledgement or whatever within the boxing establishment on a higher level was with Emil Griffith. And I mean, Emil Griffith himself, historic figure for a number of reasons, especially talking about in June right now, Pride Month. Emil Griffith is one of the best representatives for the idea of acceptance and widespread love and whatnot within boxing, one of the best there is. And so Gil Clancy working with Emil Griffith also guided him toward a world championship in a fairly short period of time, especially considering Griffith did not have a long amateur career and was kind of discovered. You said earlier that Gil Clancy wore a lot of hats.
Yeah.
Emil Griffith was literal hat maker and got discovered working in a hat making shop. So I mean, guiding
All
him
because
to,
the dude was ripped, apparently.
yeah, I mean, you look at photos of him and he doesn't look like he has an ounce of fat on him. He's just
Oh no,
absolutely ripped
shredded.
to shreds. And that was kind of, he wasn't a big puncher. He
Mhm.
wasn't super fast. Like he was fast, but he wasn't like, explosive and super fast. He was just a hard worker and he had the ability, didn't always, but he had the ability to work for 15 rounds. And they guided him to a championship pretty early. And it was like 1967 where Gil Clancy was manager of the year for guiding Neil Griffith to a championship.
And yeah, like you said, Griffith was his first like big, big name that became popular in that era. And that's like you said, for Pride Month, that's incredible too that Griffith was able to like balance both of those things because there was rumors out there of like his sexual preference and stuff like that. And obviously most famously, Benny Paret coming to surface with it before their third fight and subsequently what happened with that and stuff. But like, Clancy back then, not only did he have Griffith, around a little bit after that too, came Rodrigo Valdez, the middleweight from Colombia. And Clancy was taking him over at that point because Clancy had a pipeline for a lot of these different guys that would come into the country. And Valdez himself is a guy that should definitely be getting consideration and going into the Hall of Fame one day. I mean, the dude was a great fighter. If Carlos Monzon wasn't in that division, Valdez would have been reigning for that. Who knows for how long? You know what I mean? Because he beat everybody that there was to beat around that time. The only guy he couldn't get past was Monzon, and he came very damn close,
Yeah, I
especially
was
in
going to
that.
say, and he came pretty close.
Yeah, Monzon came close enough that Monzon decided to retire and say, you know what, I'm just gonna stay on top and let you guys can go figure it out after this. So, um, but just an expert dude, man. Like, he knew he was a good strategist too. He was a guy that can get guys in condition. He was just an overall boxing person. You know what I mean? Like from that had a lot of amateurs would work with these kids and just build them up. It wasn't just a person that would just like take in pro fighters and just kind of being a niche trainer or nothing like that. Like his gym was his actual gym, and he was one of those dudes who operated alongside Ray Arcel and all these other trainers who like shared ideas and weren't just trying to like be wary of each other and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like all of them were kind of like a boys club family, and kind of like the cut men, like you said, they were going over, oh man, I made this new concoction. You might want to try this and things like they'd be sharing secrets and doing things and all that. These trainers were doing the same thing. You were watching each other, learning from each other, picking up different tricks and going to these gyms because why wouldn't you? You had access to everything around you. There was so much boxing and so many gyms in New York back then. You couldn't help but just go around there. You take your fighters to a different gym. You go for sparring over here. Check this out. Everybody was just wired into what was going on.
Yeah. And especially in New York, too. Um,
Yeah.
there are a lot of West Coast boxing folks who will try to make it about the West Coast and vice versa. But you got to give New York its due, especially around this time. In certain eras, New York was just absolutely blown up with boxing, and this was no exception. And one of the things that Gil Clancy had going for him, partly because of his associations in New York, was that there were a number of Argentine fighters and a number of other South American fighters who, like you said, he had a bead on the pipeline. Um, just to kind of briefly go back into the history of this, there was a manager named Charlie Johnston from back in I believe he went back into the 1930s, but he really was prominent in the 40s and 50s, where he had kind of struck a deal with some folks in Argentina where they would have some fighters go to Argentina that he was associated with and help kind of blow up boxing in Argentina, while they would have Argentine fighters who kind of rose to the top. They would send and see how well they did over in the
Yeah.
U.S. and specifically in New York. So, for instance, Manuel Gatica was one of the first ones, but then a couple years later, um, for instance, Gregorio Peralta, who Gil Clancy did work with when he came to the U.S., Alex Mitef, who
Hmm.
was faced Muhammad Ali very early in his career, but Alex Mitef was a very good-looking dude, considered a future star very early in his career. When it turned out, he didn't really pan out, which was often the case when a lot of these fighters would come to the U.S. They just similar with many of the Cuban fighters, and that's not to stereotype, but I think that there was just a massive culture shock, and then finding out also that you were a big fish in a small pond, and now you're coming to all of a sudden you're just a fucking also ran. And I think that was a massive shock to a lot of fighters. But point is that Gil Clancy had associations and was able to get a hold of a lot of these fighters, and a lot of the better ones, including Oscar Bonavena. A couple of years later, worked with Oscar Bonavena. So anyway, that also gave Gil Clancy a lot of experience working with tons of different kinds of fighters and getting the inside track on fighters when he was a commentator too.
Oh, absolutely, man. He knew his shit. I used to love listening to him, his old broadcasts as I got older, and they became more, available on YouTube and stuff. But like, some of the other fighters too. He had Ralph Tiger Jones. That was a middleweight who never became champion, but tough as nails, dude. And he was in Jones's corner when Jones almost derailed Sugar Ray Robinson's comeback by defeating him by decision. He was also too, we should mention this. He was George Foreman's trainer after Zaire,
That's
you know.
true, yeah.
And he was informed, so he was with Foreman for Scott Ledoux. He was with Foreman for, when he almost bludgeoned Dennis to death. Pretty sure he was in his corner for the Lyle fight. And he was there and he said he was there backstage he was afterwards too for the Jimmy Young fight. And he said he witnessed Foreman, having that complete mental, breakdown, saying he ran around naked, saying he was going to die and Jesus and whatever else was going on. So he was there for all that, you know what I mean? And not only that too, is that afterwards, when, he started like calming down his career a little bit and he was, focusing more on commentating, he still, in the 90s, he trained Oscar De La Hoya for a brief spell, or he was co-trainers with Robert Alcazar.
So speaking
Whatever
of
you want.
fighters who went through trainers,
Yeah, right. Jesus. That's a whole story in itself. And he was with Jerry Cooney when Cooney came back to fight Foreman, coincidentally.
yeah, he worked with a number of fighters.
Jerry Corey as well.
Yeah, Jerry Quarry, he was in later on. And then he was also working with, like, for instance, I saw on his resume Johnny Persall, who was a
Oh, yeah,
really good
yeah.
light heavyweight in the 1960s, but just fell short because it was a real deep division and he just didn't quite reach the
Very good fighter until Jimmy Ellis ravaged him in one round, and that kind of finished
yeah,
him. He
turned the
was
tables.
sure. He the thing about Clancy is that also is that like when I was a kid and I would watch him and I would catch HBO shows that like obviously back then in the 90s when we were coming up the broadcast team was always George, Larry, and Jim Lampley. But the occasions where either George was going to fight or he had a different engagement or whatever it may be, they bring in Clancy. And I always enjoyed it when they did because I would find it to be kind of a treat. Like I didn't really know much about him, about his training history and stuff like that. I was still learning the game, but I enjoyed his voice. He had like a very distinct voice, and him kind of being an older dude, like he clearly knew what he was talking about. You know what I mean? Like he had a good way of articulating things from a trainer's perspective and breaking it down and all that. And like for a guy that was an analyst for so many years, this was second nature to him. And so, he was really good. The only thing I will say though, and I still laugh about this to this day, and I always kind of wonder is that so during the Foreman Moore fight, right? When Foreman knocks him out, and you hear Lampley go, it happened, right? And then you hear silence for a second, and then all of a sudden, you just you hear Gil Clancy. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Here's a guy I thought was a clubber, a slugger, and all of a sudden it stops, and then he just stops talking. And I wonder if someone was like in production was yelling there, tell Gil to shut up and just let this play out. You know what I mean? Because it was unnecessary what he was saying. And all of a sudden he just stopped. Like Lampley said it happened and happened, and then he wasn't going to talk anymore. Like you're just going to let the scene unfold. And then you hear Gil start rambling a little bit, and they're like, yo, tell him to shut up.
They probably did. They
Yeah,
probably
right?
did.
Because that's what he says. He was like, here I thought the guy was a clubber, a slugger. He couldn't do. And then he just, out of nowhere, he just stops
Yeah,
talking.
somebody was like smacked him on the shoulder. They're like,
Yeah, like, shut the fuck up. Yeah. Stop criticizing him too. What the hell? But he was a great analyst though. If you also look back too, I mean, like think about it. When they did Yaki Lopez, Saad Muhammad Yaki Lopez too for the belt, one of the greatest fights of all time. And that the round where Lopez was it like round 9? Where Lopez like takes over for a minute and starts beating the ever living daylights out of
I
Saad
think it
Muhammad.
might be the eighth. but that doesn't even matter. Point is, whatever the
But
great round is, yeah, yeah, yeah.
you see it, and then when he starts countering with those right hands, you hear Clancy, beautiful, beautiful. You see how beautiful counters, like almost like he's a trainer at that point, because he's like getting, how trainers do. Beautiful. Oh, look at the beautiful combinations right there. Ah, man. And it was cool. Like, he was a great guy. And the
We're gonna.
times I met him, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think we're gonna have to do a part two.
Oh, absolutely. There's a ton of dudes,
Yeah,
South
there's
American
too
trainers and
many,
others
like,
who need
yeah,
their followers. Yeah.
too many big names and too many big moments we left out. But I mean, yeah, dude, even just with the handful that we did mention, like with Gil Clancy, it's covering a lot of ground, not just in terms of time, but in terms of big fucking fights and big fighters.
Yeah. Absolutely, 1,000%. And
And that,
again, that shows you how integral they play in the part of the sport. Like, they're a team, a boxer and their trainer. A lot of people, try to downplay it or nothing like that. But like, if you have a real trainer and a guy who's loyal and just does all that shit, and not just someone who's talking about, I'm gonna let him out of the cage, or I had to say that, or one of those other dudes, you know what I mean? But like, a legitimate guy like a Ray Arcel, like an Eddie Futch, like an Angelo Dundee or Gil Clancy, or one of those guys that just a lifer in boxing from beginning to end, knew all the tricks of the trade, all that. And unfortunately, I don't know if we're ever going to have trainers like that. I know, like I said, man, Nacho Bernstein's still around. And I know that guy has a wealth of experience, but I don't follow him enough to know if he's there mentoring the next generation of these dudes who he's like going to pass this shit on to. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I really don't know.
yeah.
I mean, I know he's older, but yeah, I don't even know. He's always been kind of surly too, though. He's always kind of been like, off in his own shit. Like he's not like a superstar trainer in that regard. He's not like, come
Yeah,
in.
he's always been a little bit more low key. I remember Freddie Roach saying on one of those early 24/7, Nacho's an asshole. Well, that was like the first thing he said. He was like, I don't like him. And then the very next scene, you see Nacho Bernstein running up with like boxing gloves and memorabilia for him to Pacquiao to sign to give to his friends back home or sell or whatever he was gonna do.
I
But
believe that shit, dude.
yeah,
Well, yeah, we'll get into more trainers later on. No, dude, it was a lot of fun. Definitely. I mean, there's still a lot of ground to cover, but we covered a pretty good amount of ground.
I think we did. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to revisit for sure. But hey, dude, I appreciate you fucking doing a little bit of research because I know we both were looking up stuff and trying to figure out some funny moments and good moments and stuff like that. A lot of it was just pulled from our memory, but nonetheless, still got to look
Yeah.
up a little bit.
Always. Can't just do this from scratch all the time, man. I'm not that good.
We're not
Plus,
Gray Johnson or anything.
well, Corey Erdman, for that matter, our homies.
I mean, honestly, between the four of us, we do remember a lot of boxing shit. That's true,
We'll say that, man. Very happy for that too.
for
Nice
sure.
little group we got.
Well, everybody who listened in, we appreciate you very much. And hopefully, like I said during the last episode, let me know if there are any issues, but there shouldn't be. I'm pretty sure I took care of all the podcast stuff. If you listen in through the podcast apps, thank you. Subscribe, leave a rating, leave a comment. Appreciate that. If you watch on YouTube, same thing. Subscribe, comment, all that sorts of thing. We appreciate it. And on social media, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on Facebook and it's kind of on X/Twitter, but it's on Instagram too. So go ahead and say hello there. Blah blah blah. Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, yo.
Later, everybody.